Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 142 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, which I hear from reliable sources is but a trifle that Sauron fancies.
I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but
I know, I'm not sure.
You can send him the MP3 as an earnest of your goodwill.
There you go.
But folks, go ahead and pull up a bench in the common room, and we'll be right there. I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, who wants absolutely nothing to do with Wergild, Alan Sisto.
For good reason, I'd say. But for the first time ever, we have someone else joining us tonight for our discussion of the first part of the Council of Elrond. One might call it the last alliance of podcasters, or perhaps the first.
Ah, I remember well the splendor of their banners. They recalled to me the glory of the start of our second season. But no, that's true, folks. Joining us tonight, even though we're going to cover a whole 6 pages in one episode, is none other than the Tolkien Professor himself, Dr. Corey Olsen.
Hey, thanks, guys. Really excited and honored, I should say, to be joining you guys. And, you know, I'll try the best I can to keep up with you.
No doubt. The question's going to be whether we can slow down to your pace when we join you next week on Exploring the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, man. Yeah. No, it will certainly be a bit of a change of pace. You'll be joining me live.
Right.
On our totally different context here.
Yes.
So that'll be Tuesday, November 5th. We start at 9:30 p.m.-ish, 9:30 p.m.-ish Eastern time. And so you can join us, of course, the primary way to join us is on our Twitch channel at twitch.tv/SignumU.
There you go. We're looking forward to that, man. That's going to be so much fun.
We really are. And folks, we'll put some information up in our show notes about where you can join us for that live next week. But Corey, I'm really glad we've got you here because there's a segment on this show that we've done exactly once before, and I've really been wanting to do it again, and we're going to get a chance to do it in this episode. It just so happens that you're the perfect person to join us for it. See, when we've got a really big Middle-earth question that we just can't find one simple answer for, we bring together as many scholarly opinions as we can for a segment we call The Council.
And it's almost like we planned all along to bring back the segment called The Council for this first episode on the Council of Elrond.
Yeah, almost.
Yeah, it's a little almost fortuitous, isn't it?
Almost like we did that on purpose, yeah. Truthfully, it really just worked out so well because we actually have one of our scholarly sources here on the podcast with us. And that person, who is, of course, again, Dr. Corey Olsen, he's written my favorite angle on this question that I've ever read. So I want to go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
So, over the course of these first few episodes on Book 2, we've talked about the tone shift that's gradually taken place from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, and it's continued from Book 1 to Book 2 of Lord of the Rings. Now, I think one of the most obvious examples of the vastly different tone of the Lord of the Rings versus The Hobbit is the text's treatment of Rivendell and the elves who live there. Now, of course, Rivendell plays a really big role in both stories, and I kind of feel like almost as if there's two Rivendells.
Yeah, I mean, you got the last homely house of the Hobbit where the elves laugh and sing ridiculous songs in the trees, you know, the tra-la-la-lally and don't dip your beard in the foam, father. And then there's Imladris of the Lord of the Rings, the great stronghold and bastion of elvish lore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one place, but with two very different characterizations. And, you know, frankly, that's because it's in two quite different stories. But that's the question before the council today. How do we reconcile these two very different versions of Rivendell and the people who live there as readers who are trying to read the Middle-earth Legendarium as a continuous story? Corey, do you have any thoughts on the question as we get started?
Yeah, this is certainly a very common stumbling block. And I would say it seems to me to be the number one stumbling. So there's always, you know, there are a lot of people who read The Hobbit as a child or have The Hobbit read to them as a child and who come to The Lord of the Rings later on. That's a very common path. But of course, there are also a lot of people who discover The Lord of the Rings and then go back and read The Hobbit afterwards. And it seems to me a lot of people who go about it that way don't ever really like The Hobbit very much, at least not nearly as much, obviously, as the people who read it first. And in particular, I find that people who have that experience absolutely loathe Chapter 3. They just cannot handle the tra-la-la-lally when they're coming to that with the Lord of the Rings expectations and associations of Rivendell. So, I mean, it certainly is a major issue. The first thing that I would say about it is I think that what we're seeing here is not actually as different as it seems at first.
Okay.
I think that, to me, the kind of key of all of this is that we're seeing the same thing from two very different directions. And when we do, it looks very different, like it's in a very different context. But I am really not at all convinced that what we're seeing is actually something very different.
Excellent.
And there's a lot that we could say about that, but let's I hear from some of the other people first, and then I'll respond to and maybe try to rebut some of the things that other people might have to say about this.
Sounds like a plan.
Excellent. That sounds great.
So we're going to take a closer look at these two versions of Rivendell. We're going to start with the Rivendell of the Hobbit. Now, just a couple of episodes back, we talked about the name The Last Homely House. In The Hobbit, it's the last homely house west of the mountains, or the last homely house in the west. We talked about how that name indicates that it's a last bastion of civilization against the wild. It's a place of rest and comfort before one crosses the mountains into the land of wargs and goblins. In The Lord of the Rings, it's only called Last Homely House twice. And one of those times, it's the last homely house east of the sea, which is very different. It kind of indicates a connection to Valinor, to the Valar, and even to the Noldor who have passed over. It suggests this place is a bastion of wisdom, of enlightenment, almost like a little embassy of the Blessed Realm.
Yeah, I think that's all true. I mean, of course, it is still homely, too. We saw a lot of the homeliness of Rivendell in the last chapter. But I think it's really significant that Tolkien only calls it the last homely house twice in this book, and then never again. To me, it almost feels like he knew it had become just far too grand of a place for that name.
Yeah, it's grown, right.
Yeah, exactly. It's become imladrous. And that brings me to the first voice in the council here today, which is that of John Garth. Okay. In chapter 12 of Tolkien and the Great War, Garth is actually writing about the Mar Vanwa Tialieva, the Cottage of Lost Play from the Book of Lost Tales. But he observes something that's relevant here. He says, in Mar Vanwa Tialieva itself, there is more than a hint of elven Rivendell, with its hall of fire where tales are told and songs sung. Now, I think he's right. I think there's more than a hint, especially if we're looking at Rivendell and the elves of Rivendell and the Hobbit. I do feel like we can see a clear line from the fairies of the Cottage of Lost Play. Remember, this is the place where the children play with the gnomes, and you have to become as very little folk, even as you stand upon the threshold, which, by the way, is almost word for word what they tell your kids before they meet Tinkerbell at Disney World.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. It's you really do see kind of a clear line from that to from that Cottage of Lost Play to Tra-la-la-lally.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. In a note to the previous chapter, Hammond and Scull in The Lord of the Rings Reader's Companion observe a similarity that arises when one compares the depiction in The Hobbit to that in Lord of the Rings. They say, in Tolkien's illustration Rivendell, published in The Hobbit, Elrond's house seems very small compared to its description in The Lord of the Rings, when Sam says, it's a big house, this, and very peculiar, always a bit more to discover. Sam's remark recalls the Cottage of Lost Play in the Book of Lost Tales, which looks small from the outside, but is spacious inside.
Yeah. Also recalls the TARDIS a little bit.
I knew you were going there, man. I knew it. It's got to get the Doctor Who.
It's been too long since we had a Doctor Who reference.
It
on
is,
the show.
yeah. It's been quite a while. Yeah.
So, okay, a few ways in which the place itself is arguably whimsical and unrealistic. I guess that's kind of those are strong words, but, arguably that, much like the Cottage of Lost Play. Right. And there are ways in which the inhabitants appear to be that way too, at least within the pages of The Hobbit, right, Corey?
Yeah, I mean, so and this is where it's that first impression, right? I mean, imagine if we came to chapter 3 in The Hobbit and we went straight to the paragraph like describing Elrond, the kind as summer paragraph, right? Yeah. And how like he was descended from the heroes of the older days, right? I mean, all that stuff. And of course we get references to Gondolin in that context as well, and its connection back to ancient Gondolin, and so in fact, like the whole rest of the chapter would fit in really well with the Lord of the Rings Rivendell. The only problem is the tra-la-la-lolly business, right? If we just
pretty much.
If nobody happened to be baking bannocks on that particular evening, right, no one would have an issue. So that's one of the first things that I would point out is that, again, most of the time they behave kind of like we might expect them to in the Lord of the Rings. So the issue really is the way that they behave, the tra-la-la-lolly song itself, and the kind of silliness and apparently frivolous nature of the elves. And there's no question, I absolutely agree in the memory of the Cottage of Lost Play. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, kind of indirectly, that I would say why I don't really think that Rivendell in The Lord of the Rings is fundamentally different than the Rivendell of The Hobbit. And that's just because Tolkien, as much as, his ideas do change and develop, and he sometimes does legitimately change his mind about stuff. The more I read, we've been doing in my Mythgard Academy series, we've been reading and discussing our way through the whole History of Middle-earth series for several years now. And, we're in volume 9. The more we've studied the history of Middle-earth together in that series, the more convinced I become that Tolkien never actually cut anything. Like, he never completely abandons an idea.
No, that's true.
Just when you think he does, you'll see it like clandestinely cropping up, here and there.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, he barely ever even cut passages. I always joke in those discussions that he's got a drawer in his desk that he puts all of the sentences that he cuts when he revises, because you'll see him pull them out like years later. He'll pull it out and it'll go in, like almost exactly as it was before he cut it out. So Tolkien is very, I don't know what exactly the correct word is, whether it's conservative or retentive. He does not leave stuff behind very readily.
That's true.
And so for that reason alone, like my predisposition is to believe that it's not, night and day different between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because nothing is night and day different. But so I definitely think that we can see the connections back to his old stuff, right? So it's even, again, presumptively, I think that we can see that a lot of the things, as much as his ideas about elves and fairies changed from back in the teens, up through, the 40s when he was writing The Lord of the Rings, a lot has changed in his mind and in his goals as a writer in that time. But again, he's not really, I think, absolutely dropped any of it. So I absolutely think that there's a really strong connection there. And that connection to childishness, right? Childishness or childlikeness is to me one of the most important things, right? We see the explicit link to children in the Cottage of Lost Play.
Cottage of Lost Play, yeah.
We don't have that explicit connection to children. And yet, if you kind of push people who hate the elves of chapter 3 of The Hobbit, right? What they don't like about it is that they seem childish.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's just like they don't have the dignitas of Tolkien's elves. Right. They're acting like children. But the thing is, I don't think that's bad. I mean, I don't want to place way too much emphasis on that one stray sentence, but when the narrator in The Hobbit tells us that the dwarves think them ridiculous, but that is a very ridiculous thing to think, right?
Right.
We're given this little caution because, and a lot of people don't seem to heed that.
Right.
Many readers just cheerfully join in with the dwarves.
Yeah, that's right. They are ridiculous.
Dwarves. I'm on Team Dwarf, man. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. But the narrator has cautioned us, right? No, if you think them ridiculous, that is a very ridiculous thing to think. We're prompted there to think beyond that, right? Or to try to look beyond that. So I definitely, it's clear that there is a difference, right? We're seeing something different. We're seeing at the very least, we're seeing a different side of the elves there in The Hobbit as we're coming in. And it certainly does connect back to the earlier stuff. Does it connect forward? Can we see continuity between those ridiculous songs and antics of the elves at the beginning of that and the later elves, the elves of The Lord of the Rings? I kind of think we can, but let's go on and hear
going
from
and get there.
What other folks say about that.
That sounds great. Excellent. Well, now let's go ahead and take a look at the other Rivendell, the Imladris of Lord of the Rings.
I feel like I need to add the full Prancing Pony Podcast effect to that.
I do kind of feel like I need to put it in all caps. Imladris.
Yeah.
The place with the dignitas. And,
right.
None of that silliness here. This is, in Lord of the Rings, this is the last refuge of the Noldor in Middle-earth after not only the fall of Beleriand, but, the shenanigans in Eregion, of course, the death of Gil-galad. These are dignified people in Lord of the Rings, right?
Yeah, they are. I mean, we're talking about a place that can trace its lineage back to Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, the challenger of Morgoth in the Elder Days. This is not Tinkerbell.
Definitely not.
No. And of course, it wasn't just a refuge, right? We know from the history of Galadriel and Celeborn and Unfinished Tales that Imladris was established as a refuge and stronghold by Elrond after Eregion fell. It was besieged for years. It ended up being a major strategic point in the push by Elrond and Gil-galad to remove Sauron from Eriador in the Second Age. And it was after that it was determined that it would be the Elvish stronghold in the east of Eriador, which, of course, is replacing the ruined Eregion.
Right. I mean, and Gandalf even called it a fortress in the previous chapter. We talked about that in episode 140. Pippin called Frodo the Lord of the Ring, and Gandalf chastised him and said, no, we don't do that. And said, we're sitting in a fortress. Yeah. And as we'll see later in this chapter, it is the place people go to for counsel. And maybe we shouldn't be too surprised that, an elf like Legolas would know about it, or a dwarf like Glóin, who has been here before. But even Denethor, we'll learn later that when Denethor heard about Faramir's dream, he remembered that Imladris was of old the name among the elves of a far northern dale, where Elrond the half-elven dwelt, greatest of lore masters. So obviously it does have a reputation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think about the way that the human cultures think of the elves, right? We really have kind of two data points in a sense, right? We have the reputation of the elves of Lothlorien, and we have the reputation of Imladris, right? And we don't get much on that. That comment from Denethor, Sean, that you just read is like the data point about that, really, as far as the men are concerned. There's no evidence that the Rohirrim, for instance, remember about Rivendell, right?
No.
But they, of course, know about Lothlorien because it's not far away. It's just on their northern borders.
And Fangorn as well,
Right, exactly. And what we see from them, as well as from Boromir, right, when he's on the edges of Lothlorien and not wanting to go in, is they're scared of them, right? I mean, they know that there's something other, and it's kind of freaky, and they are worried about, what the elves will do and what they could do. It's clear that they, have knowledge and power that is unknown, but it's clear there's something obviously untamed and dangerous about Lothlorien as far as the mainstream human culture is concerned.
Yeah. Lady of the Golden Wood and all that.
Exactly. Whereas Rivendell, again, we only get the one data point. They don't talk about it in Rohan and don't remember it as far as we know. But the what seems to fit with Denethor's memory, right? That Elrond the Lore Master lives there. It's a similar kind of level of foreignness, right? The strange, unnatural knowledge, enduring knowledge and magic of the elves. I'm sure that when Boromir talks about taking the quest on himself, as he will when he talks, when he tells his part of the story later on in the council, he clearly is undertaking it, claiming the right to take the dangerous quest because he's best equipped, to succeed in this quest. Right. It's easy, I think, to think of that only as meaning because, it's awful far away and there's a lot of stuff between here and there. And, like the chances of dying along the way are pretty, you've got to be fairly hardy. And I'm pretty hardy. And I think I can make it between here and Rivendell. But I think there's more than that, right? I think that there's also because you never know what's going to happen to you when you get there. You're taking a risk by going to this stronghold of ancient elvish power, and who knows? So I mean, think about other legends and stories of people who go to seek an oracle in the far distance, right? And the idea that they might not ever return, that they might be destroyed, that who knows what could happen.
It's not just the travel that's the risk, it's the arrival.
It's the arrival that could be an even greater risk as far as Boromir is concerned. So I do think...
why didn't he send Faramir?
Right. Well, see, Boromir is both proud and brave, right?
There
he takes the danger upon himself. But anyway, I mean, I do think that there's an element there for Boromir. Yeah. So, I think that we can see that this sort of consistent, on the one hand, I think that there is a similarity between the way that Boromir looks at both of them. However, there's also a difference, right? Because again, like the Golden Wood, I mean, it's a forest, right? It's this wild, uncertain, like you cross the boundaries of this forest and then you're just kind of putting yourself in the power of these unknown wild elves. But Rivendell's a house, right? Imladris is again, it's more like the house where the reclusive oracle lives, right? Yeah. So it does seem to have a different feel. And the fact that Denethor remembers that he is the greatest of lore masters, right? It is the house of the greatest of lore masters. And so it's in a different sort of subcategory, right? Same general category of this sort of elvish mystery, but a different sort of more tame. It is a homely house, right? Dennis
There's civilization of some
civilized,
sort.
yeah.
Exactly. So again, that's all we can kind of piece together. I mean, we get very few data points about what is remembered about them, by humans in the far distant places. But it does seem to have both those similarities and differences to their general attitude towards elves.
Well, in Master of Middle-earth, Paul Coker called Rivendell a rallying point for all the races of Middle-earth endangered by the impending war. And then in an essay called Hell in the City by a Charles Hutter, which was in Jared Lebdel's essay collection, A Tolkien Compass, he says Rivendell is a notable place. Horizontally, it is a center of Middle-earth.
So there we go, the two Rivendells. And, again, we've got one, the tra-la-la happy place where elves sing ridiculous songs. And then we've got Rivendell, the fortress and the center of lore, home of the lore master. Now, here's where we want to talk about how they come together. How do we bring them together?
Yeah, reconciliation here. Because
Verlyn Flieger has said, and she's speaking, I guess, more about the elves of Rivendell specifically, not the place, but I think we've been doing both. That the difference is proof of Tolkien correcting a mistake. She says it's in an essay entitled Tolkien on Fairy Stories, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings. It's published in her essay collection, Green Suns and Fairy. And this essay takes as its thesis, more or less, a comment from Tolkien himself that the earlier part of The Hobbit was too whimsical, too childish, and that he intentionally went the other way with Lord of the Rings.
And that was from a letter to his Aunt Jane Neave in 1961. That's letter 234 in Carpenter's collection. And it's a letter that's come up a number of times for us already this season. He says, I've only once made the mistake of trying to meet children halfway, to my lasting regret. And I am glad to say with the disapproval of intelligent children in the earlier part of The Hobbit. But I had not then given any serious thought to the matter. I had not freed myself from the contemporary delusions about fairy stories and children. I had to think about it, however, before I gave an Andrew Lang lecture at St. Andrews on fairy stories. And I must say, I think the result was entirely beneficial to The Lord of the Rings, which was a practical demonstration of the views that I expressed. What do you think, Corey?
Well, okay. So here's my problem. My problem is I disagree with Tolkien here fairly strongly. I think that Tolkien, in his retroactive dislike of The Hobbit, I think he's dead wrong a lot of the times. In his assessment of The Hobbit, I think he's too harsh on himself. I don't question.
That's true.
I don't question his overall narrative. Sure, he wrote The Hobbit, and you can certainly see evidence of exactly what he says, of kind of, towing the traditional party line on fairies. Certainly, again, you go back to the Cottage of Lost Play, and the fairies that we see there, they're diminutive. They have wings. Christopher Tolkien, in his notes in the Book of Lost Tales, is super cagey about it. Like, he wants to sort of make out that his father didn't do that kind of fairy. Like, he seems to want to make his father more like consistent throughout his life than his father in fact was. But I think that it's pretty clear that Tolkien was at least comfortable interacting with those traditional Victorian concepts of fairies in the early days, even though he always had different ideas from that. But he was comfortable interacting with it. Then he writes on fairy stories, and from there, he's quite consistent. So I agree with Tolkien's overall assessment there. The thing that I disagree with is his tone. Note that letter to Jane Neave. 1961. Tolkien's almost 70. This is a 70-year-old Tolkien reflecting back on a book that he wrote 30 years ago at this point. Okay.
So is he telling this book to get off his lawn, basically?
Kind of,
he's just kind of a cranky old man here.
And keep in mind also, 1961, this is the year after he sat down to revise The Hobbit, right? He was finally going to fix The Hobbit, right? And do this, so he's going to do the, and what he did when he sat down to change it, he wrote about 2.5 chapters of the revised Hobbit, not just the revisions he made, of course, to like make the, chapter 5, the ring story coincide with what, no. Like from top to bottom, he was going to fix it, right? All these things he didn't like about it. And if you read, and you can read them in volume 2 of the 2-volume version anyway of John Ratliff's History of the Hobbit, you can read the revised text. And if you read the revised chapter 1 and 2, what you find is that it's like The Hobbit with all of the fun sucked out of it. I mean, it's like every line that you enjoy, everything that you laughed at as a child has been cut.
Yeah. The humor and
you're right.
The relatability.
Yeah. I mean, it's the Hobbit, and he stopped writing it because basically, people that he gave it to read were saying, no, this is not The Hobbit. This. I mean, and that was the way it was phrased. They said, right, this is great, but it's not The Hobbit. And I think that thing that made it not The Hobbit, right, that thing that he removed from it is exactly that spirit, that spirit of whimsicality. And the thing that made it fun was the way that he was addressing children. So I get how his ideas have changed. And I can certainly understand how, in retrospect, 30 years later, having, come to the place that he had come and being, as he, becomes older and more firmly established in both in his ideas and frankly, in his career as a writer, he feels that he can more, a 70-year-old Tolkien is much more likely to be like, I'm going to make no compromise with that dratted Victorian tradition, right? I'm just going to forget it, go in a completely opposite direction. Whereas what he actually did back in the 30s when he wrote The Hobbit was something that was really quite beautiful because he was doing it, but doing it well. And not he wasn't, again, I think he's being unfair to himself. He's not just writing it is true that Victorian fairy tales are often written, or even just Victorian children's books, are often written in this very preachy, very condescending tone, which he is to an extent imitating in the narrator's style in The Hobbit. But he doesn't do it that way. He's much better at it than that's why The Hobbit was really successful compared to other children's books of its day. It stood out among the children's books of its day because he did it really well. And the spirit of it was a really inclusive and really empowering one for children rather than being sort of condescending the way that it often was. So again, I think that he really, in my opinion, when he badmouths The Hobbit in his later years, he's kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So again, I don't disagree about his overall opinion, his overall, narrative of what happened, but I do disagree with the sort of the spirit of his later condemnations.
Sort of how harsh he is on it. And it sounds like, would you say that he bridged that gap in The Hobbit better than he seems to have thought in hindsight?
Yeah, exactly.
He bridged that gap between
I can kind of understand how he's looking back on this thing that he wrote 30 years ago, and he's having what sounds to me like the same kind of experience that lots of us have had who have read stuff that we wrote 30 years ago, right? And he's reading, he's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that's so embarrassing.
It's kind of like when we listened to our first season.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I can empathize with that feeling, but I feel like that particular flavor of embarrassment is kind of clouding his. I just don't think he's really evaluating The Hobbit as children's book objectively there.
That's fair.
Yeah.
All right, Corey. So let's just cut to the chase here. Do you really believe that we can reconcile these two different versions of Rivendell as readers looking at this as a continuous story? Or do you believe that Tolkien just isn't quite completely successful? I know you think he was too harsh on it, but was there a point where he could have been harsh at all? Right? Is there any way in which he wasn't successful in his depiction of Rivendell and The Hobbit? And we just have to accept that as a flaw to some extent or another.
Well, I mean, it's hard to argue that there's no flaw whatsoever in Chapter 3. I mean, to a certain extent, if such a large percentage of Tolkien fans hate it, there's probably a reason. It'd be easy for me to sit and be like, well, everyone. The problem is everyone's always been wrong about this chapter. It's in fact brilliant,
right?
And to a certain extent, I'm totally willing to say that, actually. But
I'll say it with you standing behind me. Yeah.
I'm not totally afraid to go there, but I mean, obviously, it can't be viewed as perfectly successful, or else fewer people would have been troubled by it, I think. However, I really don't think that it's nearly as big a flaw. I certainly don't think that it is a contradiction or just a complete, like that he's just going in a totally wrong direction here.
Okay.
So here's the thing. The primary way that I would urge you to think about this when you're comparing the two of them is think about the point of view. Let me go back for a second to a point that we raised earlier on.
Okay.
The name, The Last Homely House. right?
Yeah.
When we got to that passage, when we got to the paragraph that includes that phrase, the last homely house east of the sea, I hadn't been, I totally read over that in the same way that I think I've been reading over that for the last 40 years, which is just like, okay, it's the last homely house, of course, but I never noticed the significance of that east of the sea addition and how exactly as you said, it's very remarkably different from the last homely house west of the mountains and the last homely house east of the sea places Rivendell in a completely different context. In fact, you're literally turning around 180 degrees and looking at it from the other direction. Right?
Yeah.
And so when we got to that part in exploring the Lord of the Rings, like that completely derailed everything I was planning to talk about that day. And we just talked about that phrase for like an hour and a half. Like we spent the whole class talking about that one phrase, because what it suggests is not only it doesn't just change the direction you're looking, like the cardinal direction from which you were looking at the last homely house. It also changes it in time, right? So the last homely house west of the mountains in The Hobbit, the last homely house means as Bilbo is going towards the wild, right, through civilized lands and then through the lone lands, and then he gets to the last homely house, this final refuge of civilization before he crosses the boundary into the wild, and then he's in the mountains, and then he's off, and Bjorn's house, which is kind of a little refuge, but it's pretty wild there too, right? It's certainly not outside the wild, right? Very wild place. Right. And then Mirkwood, right? So, as it's part of Bilbo's journey. He's seeing that from his, from this Shire-oriented perspective as he's leaving the familiar things behind and going off into areas that are more and more dangerous and more wild. But Last Homely House East of the Sea not only means that we're thinking about coming from west to east and hitting the last homely house from the other side, which of course also suggests this is not just Bilbo coming home to Rivendell, right, and seeing it from the eastern perspective. Thinking of it as the last homely house east of the sea, who would think of it as the last homely house east of the sea? Elves would think of it as the last homely house. In fact, seaward bound elves would think, those who are on their way to the Grey Havens would find it the last homely house east of the sea. Because there isn't any, outpost of elvish civilization between Rivendell and the Grey Havens, right? There are other elves wandering about, but it is, from an elvish perspective, the last homely house east of the sea. But of course, there's also chronologically as well, right? As we moved through the Third Age and towards the dominion of men and the fading of elves, right? There is also a sense in which Rivendell is the last refuge of the old elvendom. Right.
And the last one standing.
Exactly. So east of the sea, it is the last homely house. So it is the last homely house in Middle Earth, right? The last,
because all the homely houses west of the sea are underwater. They're currently in
or they've fallen, right? So we're looking temporarily.
Well, there are presumably homely houses like the Cottage of Lost Play, in Elvenhome, right?
Well, yeah.
Exactly. So until you actually get to Marvanya Tialieva and the other places, Cortirian and wherever else, the actual places on Elvenhome and in Valinor, this is the last one that's here. In Middle Earth.
Yeah.
This is a roundabout way of coming back to that same question. When you look at Rivendell in The Lord of the Rings and you look at Rivendell from The Hobbit, just as thinking about, those two different names with, the West and the East in them, we're looking at, I think, the same thing from two different directions, right?
Yeah.
Bilbo is what is Bilbo primarily struck by? He's struck by the elvish singing. Keep in mind that the reaction that Bilbo has to the Tra-la-la-lally song, howsoever ridiculous we as readers might think the song is, Bilbo's rapturous response to the song is actually fairly similar, not exactly the same and not described in the same terms, but you think of the way that Frodo is transfigured by the music that he hears in the Hall of Fire, right? Elvish singing is not a thing to miss, right?
Right.
So, and Bilbo, who has, is at the weary end of a long and dangerous journey, certainly the longest he's ever taken, is, tempted to stay out and listen to the elves all night rather than going to bed again, we're given cues to think that how he responds to the elves, although the song that they sing, which is given to us, sounds silly, it still has that impact on him. And the thing that really struck me when I was writing my book and I really kind of sat down and really for the first time in my life, really kind of worked through that song and said, well, what is this song about? What's actually going on in this song? And the thing that really strikes me, which fits in with what Bilbo's experience, right? That was so much of Bilbo's experience through The Hobbit. This is Bilbo's perspective. What is he struck by? He's struck by how strange. I mean, they're weird, right? I mean, they don't sing about the same things he sings about. I mean, they're supposed to sound strange. So if we listen to these elves and we're like, huh? Like, what's going on here? Why are they singing this? That's kind of, I think, the effect it's supposed to have, right? They're not like, they don't think like us. They're not interested in the same things. And of course, one of the things that I think that we can see at lots of different points, whether it's in the Silmarillion or the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit, is there are these times when Tolkien tries to convey to us, hey, look, elves are functionally immortal. Right. They just, they experience the world differently. They think about things differently. Every time we're thinking about, like an elvish character and how they're looking at the world and how they're feeling and how they're reacting to certain things, if we just project ourselves onto them, we're doing it wrong. Like we need to be reminded that these people look at the world in fundamentally different ways. And that's, I think, one of the things that happens at the beginning of chapter 3 of The Hobbit. It's the strangeness of the elves. And of course, the direction in which they're strange is they're strangely happy, right? They're full of this joy that Bilbo doesn't really understand, that we don't really understand, that the dwarves don't understand. It sounds ridiculous to them. But they are having a different kind of experience, and it's consistent in The Hobbit. The elves that are rolling the barrels into the water are having a similarly strange kind of experience. They are enjoying their work like very few people enjoy their work, right?
That is true.
The kind of delight that they take in the sound of the barrels as they plop into the water is not the kind of thing that most people would be thinking about in their place, especially since they're doing this manual labor while the party's going on upstairs.
Right.
So, again, it's a different perspective. Are the elves in the Lord of the Rings genuinely different? I don't believe it. And here's the thing that struck me. It's another thing that struck me during exploring the Lord of the Rings. When we got to Gildor in the Shire, Gildor in the Shire, when he starts bantering with the hobbits, it's exactly the same tone as the hobbits in chapter 3.
Yeah, that's true.
Don't dip your beard in the foam, father, is like, what? But hobbits are so dull, right? I mean, it's exactly the same register. And I was joking at the time, listening to Gildor, the way that Gildor banters with Frodo, I'm like, Gildor was totally in the crowd that night. He was totally doing the tra-la-la-lolly thing. Like that's, no question, he was there.
He was up in the tree.
And again, but remember the other thing that we're told about him at the same time, that he is of the house of Finrod, right? So, we have him connected. So dignitas, right? I mean, Gildor's got dignitas in spades, and yet he also still has that same register. We hear him singing a song to Elbereth instead of singing Tra-la-la-lolly. Right. But I'm not really convinced that he would find the two of things completely different categories of poetry or of song, maybe a little different, but I think perhaps not as much as it would seem to us. So just as when you see Rivendell from one side and you see Rivendell from the other side, you're looking at the same thing, but you're noticing, you're paying attention to different stuff, right? When Frodo wakes up in Rivendell and we have the whole Rivendell experience in The Lord of the Rings, he is sort of struck by he has a different experience, right? He doesn't see the elves just sort of happily singing out in the fields. And when he does experience their song, it's in a different context. That is, it's in the context of his reunion with Bilbo and the sort of distressing moment that occurs fairly early in his reunion with Bilbo. So again, he's in a completely different frame of mind there. But I don't see any reason to think that the elvish music going on in the Hall of Fire is fundamentally different. Like, Might there be a tra-la-la-lolly chorus going on somewhere in the Hall of Fire?
Maybe after Frodo and Bilbo leave, yeah.
Over in the corner.
Why not?
They'll be singing songs like that all night. Right?
Exactly. And again, I don't see any reason either to sort of doubt that or to be concerned about it. Like I think that it comes back to, it's a very ridiculous thing to think, right? If we don't like to imagine Glorfindel singing Tra-la-la-lolly, I think that might be a problem with us, frankly, that we want to put Tolkien's elves into a particular category. Do they have dignity? Yeah, absolutely. Are they sorrowful and remember sorrowful things and, are part of this tragic history? Yeah. But if we want to imagine Tolkien's elves as merely tragical, like there's some kind of Byronic figures dressing in black tights and just like brooding all the time, we're getting them wrong. Like there's no evidence that that's the way they are.
That's the cure. That's not the elves.
Exactly.
That's Morrissey, I don't.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. So for that reason, I mean, I do think that we can really bring them together. And there are definitely things that I would point to in Rivendell and in our experience in Lothlorien eventually as well, that we can see connecting to what is, sort of given to us in this kind of more childlike way. But even, like times when Galadriel laughs and, some of the exchanges that she has with Frodo and Sam and with everyone at the banquet at the end, right? I think there are definitely times that we can see even Galadriel, who is probably the least tra-la-la-lolly worthy of all of the elves that we meet.
Right.
Remember Sam's impression of her is that she is as merry as any lass with daisies in her hair, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So that element is even there with Galadriel, I think. And if we want to purge the Lord of the Rings elves and Rivendell of that kind of element, I think we're missing a big piece of what the elves are about.
All right,
that's great. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I wanted to know, how do we bring these together? Because, I'm even thinking about the conversation we had last week. We didn't really talk about this much, but, we saw Lindir last week.
Yes.
Right.
The way he's kind of ribbing Bilbo after the Song of Eärendil. And Bilbo's kind of giving it back. But it's a very joyful, kind of silly exchange, to sheep. Other sheep, no doubt, appear different, but we can't tell the difference between hobbits and men.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And even another thing that struck me when we were discussing this and exploring the Lord of the Rings, when Bilbo is first introduced, when Elrond pulls the surprise, right, when he introduces Bilbo.
Yes.
There, he and Bilbo banter with each other. Like Bilbo banters with Elrond.
Yes, he does.
Although, Elrond's tone is a little bit hard to judge and he's clearly teasing Bilbo about falling asleep. Right. Even Elrond is kind of, chill, he's joking with Bilbo, he's not Mr. Gravitas all the time.
Right. Yeah. That's true. No, good point.
Excellent. Well, there we have it. And thank you, Corey, for joining our council in person today. That was great.
Absolutely. And folks, we are finally ready to get back to the book because, of course, we're all about the books here at the Prancing Pony Podcast.
That's true. We bring you other Tolkien stuff from time to time. But at heart, Alan and I are fans of Tolkien's books and books about Tolkien. That's our passion.
And as you know, we read a lot of books in preparation for the show every week. So if you'd like to get your hands on a book we've mentioned, you're going to want to check out the official library page of our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. And we have links there to every book we've ever mentioned on the show, including Corey Olsen's Exploring the Hobbit.
That's right. And there's a lot of other stuff on our website, too. Show notes and book links specific to each episode, outtakes, Prancing Pony Ponderings, and a few other little extras. You'll also find a link to our online storefront where you can find shirts, mugs, stickers, and other great Prancing Pony Podcast gear as we get our designs up and running. And I can actually give you that address here, teespring.com/stores/PPP. So please check that out.
And now let's go ahead and convene the Council of Elrond and see what's on the agenda. And we're actually going to start with Sean this time around. Fire away.
Okay, starting from the very beginning of the chapter because it is a very good place to start.
Good place to start. That's right.
Next day, Frodo woke early, feeling refreshed and well. He walked along the terraces above the loud-flowing Bruinen and watched the pale, cool sun rise above the far mountains and shine down, slanting through the thin silver mist. The dew upon the yellow leaves was glimmering, and the woven nets of gossamer twinkled on every bush. Sam walked beside him, saying nothing, but sniffing the air, and looking every now and again with wonder in his eyes at the great heights in the east. The snow was white upon their peaks. On a seat cut in the stone beside a turn in the path, they came upon Gandalf and Bilbo deep in talk. "Hello, good morning," said Bilbo. "Feel ready for the great council?" "I feel ready for anything," answered Frodo. "But most of all, I should like to go walking today and explore the valley. I should like to get into those pine woods up there." He pointed away, far up the side of Rivendell, to the north. "You may have a chance later," said Gandalf, "but we cannot make any plans yet. There is much to hear and decide today." Suddenly, as they were talking, a single clear bell rang out. "That is the warning bell for the Council of Elrond," cried Gandalf. "Come along now. Both you and Bilbo are wanted."
Good to feel wanted.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Love this description of Rivendell, by the way. Is
Oh,
that
yeah.
just, I mean, I'm picturing this, the pale, cool sun, the kind of the god rays, right? You know, when the light shines through
Yeah.
the mist. I love that. Oh, it's
Yeah.
gorgeous.
And the woven nets of gossamer. Just love that
yeah.
image of the dew and the spider webs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I get a hint of recovery here. I love the fact that Frodo's
doubt.
feeling refreshed and well, and just the amount of detail in this description feels to me like he's recovered a clear view.
Yeah.
If only for a little while.
Yeah.
Well, and you can see he wants to do more, right? I want to get up and get out of here and go.
Yeah, I want to go for a walk. I want
woods.
to go explore this land around. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sadly,
what should we call this land? You didn't get. I set you up, Sean. You missed it.
I think we shall call it this land.
I think we shall call it your doom. Curse you and your sudden but inevitable betrayal. All right.
It's
Hey,
way
we got to
too
get a
long since I
Firefly
watched
reference in when we
Firefly.
can.
I'm sorry.
I love that one.
Right there.
So, yeah, the idea of recovery, though, I think you're absolutely right there. So then, of course, they come up on Gandalf and Bilbo, and we get, Gandalf, as usual, is very much down to business, and now it's time to go. Before we get any further, though, I want to, as sort of an introduction to the Council of Elrond, I want to go to a source we're likely to visit throughout, Tom Shippey in The Author of the Century. Now, I apologize, sorry, not sorry, for the lengthy quote here, but it sets up a great deal that we're going to be mentioning over the next 5 episodes, so it's really worth talking about. In Chapter 2 of Author, he says that this chapter, and I'm struggling to really not do this in Tom's voice. You know that, right, Sean?
Oh, yeah, I do know.
Chapter is a largely unappreciated tour de force.
You're doing very well. You were doing well.
I was doing well. I know. It's very hard. You just read Tom's stuff and his voice just comes out.
His voice really does come across in his words. Yeah.
You only need to meet or hear Tom once to be able to hear his prose and his voice for the rest of your life.
Seriously.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's brilliant. I absolutely love it. So he does say that this chapter is the largely unappreciated tour de force, whose success may be gauged by the fact that few pause to recognize its complexity. It breaks, furthermore, most of the rules which might be given to an apprentice writer. I would add even to a less than apprentice writer. For one thing, though it is 15,000 words long, in it, nothing happens. Oh, boy, I really hear his voice right there.
Yep.
It consists entirely of people talking. For another, it has an unusual number of speakers present, 12, and I'm going to try to not do that very often. The majority of them 7, unknown to the reader and appearing for the first time. And just to make things more difficult, the longest speech by Gandalf, which takes up half the total, contains direct quotation from 7 more speakers or writers, all of them apart from Butterbur and Gaffer Gamgee, new to the story. Other speakers, like Glowin, give quotations from yet more speakers.
I'm just thinking about how much fun this is going to be to read aloud.
Yes, it will.
With all the voices.
Yes, it will. All the characterizations. Oh, boy.
Yeah.
I'm going to basically having to voice Gandalf as, like, how would Gandalf characterize? I don't think Gandalf would do an impression, so I'm just going to do it all in Gandalf's voice. Yeah. All right.
Shippey goes on to point out that, like so many committee meetings, this chapter would could very easily have disintegrated, lost its way, or simply become too boring to follow. The fact that it does not is brought about by 2 things: Tolkien's extremely firm grasp of the history of Middle-earth and his unusual ability to suggest cultural variation by differences in mode of speech.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking about that, I think, quite a bit throughout. That little bit of word nerdery that we get from the different registers of speech from the different characters.
Absolutely. And so now we're going to transition in to the actual council itself. We get, some more description, or we can't read every word. I don't know. Corey, do you read every word? You do, because you only read like 8 of them and then you discuss them for 2 hours.
We usually do it. We do at least one full paragraph, sometimes 2 at a time. Yeah.
Because I think that probably works for fair use purposes. You're doing such a tiny little segment of the show is the actual text of the work. So you're good to go. We, of course, since we cover, 6 whole pages, in an hour and a half to 2 hours, we have to be a little more selective and not read everything. So we have to miss out on the singing birds and the bubbling waters. But it is beautiful. So folks, please read it. But then we're going to go ahead. I'm going to pick up here as they come around the corner, so to speak. He's already seen a few people he knows, and that's where I'm going to pick up. Elrond drew Frodo to a seat by his side and presented him to the company, saying, "Here, my friends, is the hobbit, Frodo, son of Drogo. Few have ever come hither through greater peril, or on an errand more urgent." He then pointed out and named those whom Frodo had not met before. There was a younger dwarf at Glóin's side, his son, Gimli. Beside Glorfindel, there were several other counselors of Elrond's household, of whom Aristor was chief. And with him was Galdor, an elf from the Grey Havens, who had come on an errand from Círdan the shipwright. There was also a strange elf clad in green and brown, Legolas, a messenger from his father Thranduil, the king of the elves of northern Mirkwood. And, seated a little apart, was a tall man with a fair and noble face, dark-haired and gray-eyed, proud and stern of glance. He was cloaked and booted as if for a journey on horseback, and indeed, though his garments were rich and his cloak was lined with fur, they were stained with long travel. He had a collar of silver in which a single white stone was set. His locks were shorn about his shoulders. On a baldric he wore a great horn tipped with silver that now was laid upon his knees. He gazed at Frodo and Bilbo with sudden wonder. "Here," said Elrond, turning to Gandalf, "is Boromir, a man from the south. He arrived in the grey morning and seeks for counsel. I have bidden him to be present, for here his questions will be answered." And that's where I'll stop for now. Elrond's brief introduction.
Right.
A few of these others are interesting to talk about. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few that Frodo knows, of course, Glorfindel and Glóin and Strider and Elrond. Strider, of course, has his action clothes on. We've got Aristor and other counselors of Elrond's household. And Hammond and Scull had a note in the Lord of the Rings Reader's Companion that in earlier drafts of this chapter, Aristor was a half-elf who was briefly considered as one of the Company of the Ring.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And of course, there's Galdor from the Grey Havens, who's kind of cool because it's like he's only indirectly important. Like we got Galdor, whoever he is, but whatever. He's on an errand from Círdan the shipwright, right?
No, and he's important.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that his whole title is given, right? Galdor is just called an elf, right? Círdan, however, is Círdan the shipwright. And that by itself, that was one of the things, I mean, I don't know, it probably wasn't in my top 10 or anything, but as a kid, I found that phrase, Círdan the shipwright, just this deeply sort of mythic thing, right? Like I knew nothing about him, right? Because I'd only just read The Lord of the Rings, so I knew almost nothing about Círdan the shipwright. But just that title was something that I always found so evocative and kind of mysterious, like the shipwright. So this is clearly not just like his job, right? Like as if you were like, Círdan the auto mechanic or something like that. Like there's something really special, especially since remember the very first introduction we get to elves was from Sam, right? Back in the Green Dragon, saying that they're sailing into the west and leaving us,
right? Yeah,
and so and this is the guy who builds the ships on which the elves are sailing. Right. So, like, clearly, I don't know anything else about him, but he's a big deal. And of course, when you look at
the shipwright,
like what Tolkien goes on to explain about him is, he's clearly a big deal. I mean, he is an ancient Teleri. I mean, it's from the Silmarillion. Like, is there a time before Círdan? Like, did Círdan wake up at Cuiviénen? We don't know, right? I mean, he could.
Right. He might very well might have.
He's the number one candidate for somebody who's
for
awake.
like
that's true.
One of the one of the surviving Aboriginal elves, potentially.
Right.
And you see the role that he is given. I almost get the impression, and this is just like pure like fun speculation on my part.
Oh, we love that stuff.
But it almost seems like Tolkien himself, so coins the phrase "Círdan the Shipwright," right? And it's almost like Tolkien himself is like, wow, that guy sounds really cool, and he keeps like adding cool roles for him because he never comes into the story. Like he has this like non-speaking role at the very, very, very end as we're getting on board.
He doesn't even get scale, right?
No.
He doesn't even get, he's a member of SAG, but doesn't even get scale because they didn't talk.
Exactly. Yeah. So in the appendices and in of the Rings of Power and the Third Age and stuff, it's like anytime we get like an extra like it turns out he's there in the battle on Mount Doom with Elendil and Gil-galad. It turns out he was the one, of course, to greet the wizards and his role with the Ring of Fire, and even the guy who like welcomed Glorfindel back from so it's like almost all of these other like kind of little things which were important to have happened, even though they're never narrated as actual stories, keep kind of getting added to his resume because he's clearly cool enough to deserve it.
Well, he's got quite the CV, and it's many, many pages long.
Exactly.
And we're going to end up doing a full sidebar on him. One of the, like Corey said, one of the more interesting side characters in the Legendarium.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that won't be really until he returns to the stage at the end of book 6 in, I don't know, another 5 years or so. But we should mention, because, my co-host, that Círdan assisted Eärendil in building Vingalad.
Yes.
So if I don't say that, Sean will, and he'll tell you that over about 20 minutes instead of 5 seconds.
Out of the silver white birches of Nimberthil. Yes.
There you go. And that's why I said it, so you wouldn't have to go into all that. Yeah. I'm kidding.
Should I just go ahead and recite the first few lines of the poem again? Because I can do that.
If that's what you insist on doing, I can always edit it out. Don't worry.
Fair enough.
I have the power.
You have the power. You have the console. Well,
I do.
Moving on, we've got Legolas.
Mm-hmm.
Strange.
I like that he's described as strange, by the way. So all those Legolas fans, just remember, he's really strange.
All the other elves we've seen, they're okay, but this is a strange elf.
Yeah.
But, I mean, he's a Mirkwood elf, right? And what do we know about them from The Hobbit? They are more dangerous and less wise. So maybe he does seem strange in context here. Little word nerdery on his name. Some folks have probably heard him called Legolas Greenleaf. Greenleaf is not really a last name. It's actually a translation of the Sindarin name Legolas. Mm-hmm. In letter number 297, Tolkien points out that a careful studier might have perceived the relation of the element las to lassi, leaves, in Galadriel's lament. Lasse lanta, meaning leaf fall, equals autumn. Right. Legolas is a compound of Sindarin laig, viridis, fresh and green, and golas, collection of leaves, foliage.
Oh, very interesting.
Can I just say I love the fact, I think it's adorable that Tolkien was under the impression that not only would people read the poems, but they would actually like read and parse the Quenya poems in order to notice things like this. I know that, there are certainly people who have done that, but, but it's just charming to see Tolkien imagining his readers pressing that closely into a long piece of Quenya poetry in order for them to make that connection.
He apparently could see into the future and saw all the Tolkien nerds who do that all the time. Right.
Exactly.
The ones who correct us on our word nerdery.
Yes.
Yeah. He foresaw that there would be 22 issues of Parma El Delamberon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Boy, that is so true. So another interesting thing about Legolas that you need to know, recently we were talking about Glorfindel, and we talked about how he had been around at the fall of Gondolin and all the things that he accomplished, and how that Glorfindel was this Glorfindel that, he went through that whole being rebodied and all of that. Legolas also appeared in the fall of Gondolin, but it's just his name. It's not the same one. So I just want to make that real clear.
Right.
And then next up, of course, we get this tall man, and frankly, you've got almost as much description of Boromir as you do of Gimli, Aristor, Galdor, Legolas combined. And Corey, I want you to touch on some of these details. We get a ton of details here. Talk about the importance of these details maybe and why Tolkien chose to spend so much time talking about Boromir compared to the others.
Well, it's a really interesting question because it's not just that you're absolutely right. It's very striking that he, we get a strange elf clad in green and brown, and that's enough of a description of Legolas. And then we get this whole paragraph about Boromir. It's not only that, but we almost never get paragraphs like this. I mean, show me the number of places where Tolkien gave a physical description of a human being in a paragraph. We get descriptions of landscape all over the place. He almost never gives us a description of people.
Down to his haircut.
Exactly. Haircut. There's a lot of, there are a bunch of characters in The Lord of the Rings whom we have no authoritative word in the text what their color of their hair is. Like, we don't even know.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's very, very unusual that he should do this at all, which certainly kind of makes it jump out. So what's sort of the pattern here? The first thing it's clear that, so that the impression that I get is that Frodo as narrator, right, is looking at this guy. And so of all of the people, in a sense, although the elves are a big deal, Aristor and Galdor and the strange elf, although they're kind of a big deal.
I think we're going to call him that from now on, Sean. That's our official name for Legolas.
For the next 5 seasons.
Seriously, Gimli, Aragorn, and the strange elf, the 3 hunters, man.
That's right. So, I mean, they're obviously a big deal, but they're also kind of, I mean, he's been meeting elves for days now, right? I mean, like, ever since he woke, I mean, he's in Rivendell, right? That's what you expect to see. He's expecting, but then there's this other guy, right, whom he didn't expect to see, whom in fact nobody expects to see, whom in fact Gandalf has never seen, because Elrond turns to Gandalf and introduces him, right? Gandalf does not even know who Boromir is or that he's arrived. Now, Gandalf knows about Boromir, but he certainly doesn't know that he's shown up. So we're clearly being directed that of all of the people in the room, from Frodo's perspective at least, Boromir's the weirdo, even weirder than Legolas. Like he's the one who stands out. So he's looking at him, and we can see him trying to like parse it, right? I don't know if he's like sort of he's not exactly Sherlocking him, but he's trying to place him, right? Okay, he's cloaked and booted as if for a journey on horseback. Okay, so we're seeing he's just come like straight from his horse into the council, right? So this is not somebody who's in fancy dress or even in plain normal dress like Aragorn. He's still in his traveling clothes. And indeed, though his garments were rich and his cloak was lined with fur, they were stained with long travel. Okay, so he's been on the road for a long time, but he is probably a person of substance, right? Because he's nobility, this is like the Sherlocking that he's doing, right? Okay, nice clothes, but stained. So he's probably come a long way. A collar of silver in which a single white stone was set. Okay, so he's not only a person of means, that possibly royalty. I mean, who wears a silver collar, right? I mean, with a diamond in it. Yikes. Okay, and his locks were shorn about his shoulders. Like, I'm not sure I understand the importance of his haircut. I'm wondering does that mean that people don't usually men don't usually wear their hair that long up in the north? Do the Breland, is Bill Ferny sporting a mullet? Or like, how are we if
anybody does, it's Bill. That's true.
It's Bill Ferny. But I mean, I assume that would mean that probably the men of Bree have shorter hair, which means probably Aragorn has shorter hair than this. I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Because if his locks were shorn about his shoulders, it's like shoulder length, or maybe even a little bit like sort of his hair kind of resting on his shoulders, right? So again, I think that's another way in which he's saying, okay, clearly not from around here. Right, definitely not from around here.
Right.
And he sees the one thing which is of great note. Of course, it kind of makes me think forward to Faramir's quiz question, right? Was there anything of particular mark about his gear? Yeah. And Frodo, in his defense, not only remembers and cites that, but notices it right off. Right. I mean, it's a very striking thing. You can tell a family heirloom when you see one, right? And that's clearly a family heirloom. That's laid upon his knees. Again, like, he's just, he could take it off and put it on the ground next to him, but the fact that he's holding it on his lap while he's at the council shows that he values it and isn't going to,
he's not just going to put it on the side. Yeah.
Right. Or like kick it under the table or something.
Yeah. Or file it with a coat check, he's not going to.
Exactly. Right. So, and then he gazes at Frodo and Bilbo with sudden wonder, right? So while Frodo is looking at him and saying like, oh, okay, I'm trying to figure out who this guy's from. Now he sees Boromir looking back at him with this look of amazement, right? Which Frodo hasn't gotten before, that kind of reaction, that kind of treatment.
Presumably because folks in the north at least know of hobbits.
They know of hobbits. They've seen hobbits.
Right.
Yeah. And he hasn't. Yeah, he's
and we'll see exactly why that is later, why he's gazing at them with sudden wonder.
Yeah.
But hey, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. No, not at all. Yeah, so we actually got a question from one of our listeners, Ashfaq, who wrote in requesting a little word nerdery on this word baldric. He said, maybe you can discover a cunning source, which I love. So a baldric is a belt or girdle, usually of leather and richly ornamented, worn pendant from one shoulder across the breast and under the opposite arm, and used to support the wearer's sword, bugle, etc. That's from the Oxford English Dictionary. And of course, that's exactly what Boromir uses his baldric for, right? To hang his horn on it. Now, as for the etymology of the word, I looked into this, and it seems that a baldric is named for the person who invented it. He was a squire in the service of Prince Edmund, Duke of Edinburgh, in the 15th century, better known as the Blackadder. And I'm sorry, I just can't.
I didn't even see that coming. That's terrible.
I just can't keep the joke going any longer. But because of the way Ashfaq phrased the question, I know that's what he wanted. So
yeah,
there you go.
Clearly, wow.
Little joke for the Blackadder fans. But no, in reality, actually, the Oxford English Dictionary says the real origins and history of the word are actually obscure. There is, however, a nearly identical word in Middle High German. There's a similar word in Old French, and there's a medieval Latin word, baldringus, of which the first part likely comes from the Latin balteus, which means belt. Mm-hmm. That may actually have Etruscan origins, but beyond that, the linguists aren't really sure exactly where this whole word comes from. So, again, going back to Blackadder, perhaps somebody someday will come up with a cunning plan to fill in the gaps.
Well played, sir. Well played.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sadly disappointed I didn't see that coming.
It was the question that suggested it. All credit to the listener on that one.
Yeah. Well, before we move on, Corey's got the next reading, some of Gloin's tale. Did I say Gloin? I meant Glowin.
You did.
We knew him back when he was just Gloin.
Now he's got the accent mark. He's all,
I know. He's all, what did we say last week? He's all pretentious now?
Yeah.
So,
oh, hey, Gloin, how you doing? Oh, it's
look at him.
Now.
He's all dressed in white with the silver, all the bling going on.
Moved up in the world. Yeah, it's
he has.
This is not a monosyllabic dwarf.
No, it is not. You're right. This is Glowin.
Yeah, I am glowing.
Yeah.
Glowin's glowing tonight. But anyway,
he's glowing. Yeah,
he is. But before I let Corey read, I wanted to go back to some of that stuff from Shippey's Author of the Century. We had that great quote early on about how one of the ways that Tolkien makes this chapter successful is his unusual ability to suggest cultural variation by differences in mode of speech. Now, before we get to Glowin's story itself, I want to point out some of the things that Shippey says about his distinctive speech patterns. He points out that dwarves, it seems, like the Norsemen whose language Tolkien assigned to them, are characteristically taciturn. Glowin's sentences tend to be short and to break where one might expect them to continue. So keep an eye out for that as Corey reads from this next little segment.
It is now many years ago, said Glowin, that a shadow of disquiet fell upon our people. Whence it came we did not at first perceive. Words began to be whispered in secret. It was said that we were hemmed in a narrow place, and that greater wealth and splendor would be found in a wider world. Some spoke of Moria, the mighty works of our fathers that are called in our own tongue Khazad-dûm, and they declared that now at last we had the power and numbers to return. Glowin sighed. Moria, Moria, wonder of the northern world. Too deep we delved there, and woke the nameless fear. Long have its vast mansions lain empty since the children of Durin fled, but now we spoke of it again with longing, and yet with dread, for no dwarf has dared to pass the doors of Khazad-dûm for many lives of kings, save Thror only, and he perished. At last, however, Balin listened to the whispers, and resolved to go, and though Dain did not give leave willingly, he took with him Ori and Owen and many of our folk, and they went away south. That was nigh on 30 years ago. For a while we had news, and it seemed good. Messages reported that Moria had been entered and a great work begun there. Then there was silence, and no word has ever come from Moria since.
Apparently the satellite phones no longer work, but shadow of disquiet. This strikes me a little bit. I'm seeing shades of Thorin all over again, right? Mm-hmm. The greed kind of settling in, this sort of just dissatisfaction with what they have, which you find out later is like a lot. I mean, they're seriously wealthy. That's not a problem anymore.
And they've got all these artistic and, presumably technological advancements, but
mostly technological. I think we talked about how their craftsmanship wasn't as good as it used to be, but their technical skills were better, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And, the other thing that it reminds me of is Numenor. Right.
Ooh,
yeah.
The unrest that comes upon Numenor. Now, it's not of this. Now, it's typically different, right? The humans in Numenor, when they have things great and they're at the apex of their power, they start fixating on the death thing, right? That's the thing that kind of gets under their craw and leads to their unrest. With the dwarves, of course, much more characteristically, it's the desire for their ancient halls, for this, so it really what you can almost see, right? Just as Thorin, not only just thinking about Thorin and the dragon sickness towards the end of the story, but think about Thorin at the beginning of the story. Think of the song that they sing in Bag End, right?
Absolutely.
Let us go and claim our long forgotten gold. Well, now let's claim our really long forgotten gold, like the gold that we forgot about before we forgot about that gold, right? Let's keep working up the chain.
What other gold can we go back and reclaim?
The gold that we forgot, we even forgot,
Exactly. So, I mean, and it's interesting because in The Hobbit, in the beginning of The Hobbit, at least, the reclaiming of Erebor, the reclaiming of the mountain and the reclaiming of their treasure is, it's nothing but, they were done wrong, right? They were kicked out of there by Smaug, and we want to take vengeance, for the death of our people and everything. And of course, look, what do we have? Similar situation, right? They were booted out of Khazad-dûm but notice that there are two differences there. First of all, Thorin's desire to return to the mountain at the beginning of The Hobbit is not unrest exactly. I mean, he's discontented with, being
he doesn't want to be. Right, exactly.
Right. Which is
having to do blacksmith work.
Exactly.
I can see him now with the little stick and the bag of his possessions on the back. And,
exactly.
Trying to find a freight train going.
Hard to I mean, I guess it's technically unrest, but it's certainly very different from the situation of the dwarves of Erebor.
Well, it seems like a more reasonable unrest. I mean, of course, you want to have your home back, right?
Right.
It's not like Dan doesn't have a home,
right? Exactly. Yeah, they're not exactly slumming it out there in Erebor. But of course, the other thing is that when he describes it, unlike the attack of Smaug, which was relatively unprovoked, provoked only by Smaug's greed, right? At hearing about the wealth of their kingdom, the destruction, the monster who came to destroy their old home was kind of their fault. Right.
Yeah.
As he admits, right. Yeah. It's kind of our, we woke the nameless fear, so we in those two ways we see, although the story is parallel, it's there's definitely some different dimensions to it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, speaking of the nameless fear, Sean, you've got a passage from Appendix A that I think we want to bring in, huh?
Yeah. I think that'll color in this a little bit.
Okay.
It says, "It came to pass that in the middle of the third age, Durin was again its king, being the sixth of that name. The power of Sauron, servant of Morgoth, was then again growing in the world, though the shadow in the forest that looked towards Moria was not yet known for what it was. All evil things were stirring. The dwarves delved deep at that time, seeking beneath Barazinbar for mithril, the metal beyond price that was becoming yearly ever harder to win. Thus they roused from sleep a thing of terror that, flying from Thangorodrim, had lain hidden at the foundations of the earth since the coming of the host of the west, a Balrog of Morgoth. Durin was slain by it, and the year after Nain the First, his son. And then the glory of Moria passed, and its people were destroyed or fled far away."
And just a reminder, folks, this thing of terror that flew from Thangorodrim, flew, as in tried to get away from, escaped.
Yes.
Why?
Fled.
The host of the West.
Did not fly.
Retreated from very fast.
Yes. Yes, exactly. As quickly as possible on the ground. We just want to make that very clear.
Yes.
Just like when Gandalf met that thing, he didn't say, literally, "Fly, you fools."
Yeah. Sprout wings and go.
Sprout wings and fly.
Anyway, just to fit this on the timeline, folks, this happened, this delving too deep and the destruction of Moria, happened in the Third Age, 1980. The dwarves fled Moria the following year.
Right. So, and to think about it in the larger context, the downfall of the North Kingdom of Arnor was in 1974. That's the fall of Fornost to the armies of Angmar, and the fall of Minas Ithil was in 2002, just a couple decades later.
Right.
So there's lots of, I mean, that was a bad time,
Yes, it was.
across.
It was a bad few decades, wasn't it?
It really was. There was the needle was really pointing in the wrong direction there for a while.
It was
in the middle of the Third Age, but now it's 3018. So all of this stuff was more than 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, that is a long time. So just keep that in mind.
All right. Well, then we get this next passage. I'm actually going to pick it up from there, and we're going to see the messenger from Mordor.
Ooh.
Then about a year ago, a messenger came to Dain, but not from Moria, from Mordor, a horseman in the night, who called Dain to his gate. The Lord Sauron the Great, so he said, wished for our friendship. Rings he would give for it, such as he gave of old. And he asked urgently concerning hobbits, of what kind they were, and where they dwelt. For Sauron knows, said he, that one of these was known to you on a time. At this we were greatly troubled, and we gave no answer. And then his fell voice was lowered, and he would have sweetened it if he could. As a small token only of your friendship, Sauron asks this, he said, that you should find this thief, such was his word, and
you
get
can see him looking at Bilbo when he says that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He's looking at Bilbo going, I didn't call you that, bro.
Such was his word. I didn't call you that.
Such was his word. I'm not calling you that.
Yeah. And get from him, willing or no, a little ring, the least of rings, that once he stole. It is but a trifle that Sauron fancies, and an earnest of your goodwill. Find it, and 3 rings that the dwarf sires possessed of old shall be returned to you, and the realm of Moria shall be yours forever. Find only news of the thief, whether he still lives and where, and you shall have great reward and lasting friendship from the Lord. Refuse, and things will not seem so well. Do you refuse? At that, his breath came like the hiss of snakes, and all who stood by shuddered. But Dain said, I say neither yea nor nay. I must consider this message and what it means under its fair cloak. Consider well, but not too long, said he. The time of my thought is my own to spend, answered Dain. For the present, said he, and he rode into the darkness.
Which is what messengers from Mordor want to do, I suppose.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So Sauron says he wishes friendship.
And threatening you before they leave, of course.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Which is also what they do. We'll give rings. You get the 3 rings back. Were the others consumed by dragons? Do we know how many were consumed by dragons? I don't remember.
Gandalf does say, well, sort of vaguely says the others the dragons have consumed.
That's right.
So presumably it's the other 4. But I got to tell you, it sounds like Gandalf is guessing there, to be perfectly frank.
Right.
Like,
yes, it does.
I mean, like, have they done a really careful survey of dragons? Like, have you or have you not eaten a dwarvish ring of power? Do you know anyone who has eaten a dwarvish ring of power? And, they compile their data and, conclude firmly that 4 of them have been eaten.
Right.
So, but they're pretty sure about the 3 that have been recovered. So anyway.
Right. So yeah, he says he's going to give the rings back, and even says you're going to get the realm of Moria. I didn't even catch that as I'm preparing for this, but that's a pretty big thing. I mean, you're talking about, hey, we've been wanting to go back there forever, and now Sauron's saying you're going to be able to keep the realm of Moria.
Does Sauron even have the ability to do that?
I know.
In the
That's
sense
like
that can Sauron really get the Balrog out of there?
Exactly. And it's me telling you can keep the realm of Wyoming forever. Really?
Yeah.
I mean, I have the authority to do that?
But also, I mean, it's not like it's not like the Balrog is taking orders from Sauron.
No,
so
clearly
it's not like Sauron is going to say, hey, Bob, remember me from the music? Can you get out of here, please?
Right.
Right.
Oh,
I mean,
I love that.
Yeah, there's, thinking about even Gandalf's words in Appendix A about the probable or maybe putative alliance between Smaug and Sauron, right. I've always wondered how that conversation would go. Like, did they have to, did he have to meet with him? Did they talk? Did he go? Or would he have gone? Right. Did he go? Would Smaug would probably not, would Smaug have just obeyed him? I kind of doubt it, right? I would sort of think there'd be a negotiation, right?
I'm a free agent,
Exactly, right. And the Balrog more so, right? It's
even more, yeah.
So yeah, I clearly think that's that's a bit of he's probably got a nice bridge he could sell him too.
His voice is writing a check that he can't exactly get.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, but the whole thing, I don't know. It almost makes me wonder, what kind of reaction were they actually looking to get from the dwarves? Right? I mean, like, this is a complete oversell. The fact that first he says a little ring, the least of rings. Right,
a trifle.
So the first thing that it goes is that it's just like so. There's this one really. If you just do this tiny little thing and it's really no big deal, but if you do that, we will give you these like everything you ever possibly could have wanted in the entire world. You know, it's like okay, right. So I mean, it's like, what are you supposed to do with that if you're the dwarves?
Exactly.
Like even imagining the dwarves are not suspicious, right? Even if they're just taken totally at face value, like how do you even take that at face value? Like,
I know, really. It reminds me of Morgoth when he overplayed his hand against Feanor, right? He's at the doors. And he goes, "Oh, by the way, if you think that those Silmarils are safe," and Feanor's, "Oh no, now I see through you." Right. I mean, that's what's happening here. This is Sauron overplaying his hand, just like Morgoth overplayed his hand. Yeah, and that's not surprising. I mean, really, it's what they do.
Right.
I suppose it's the pride that goes with their position, isn't it?
Oh, of course.
They think that they can get one over on everybody.
Yeah. But boy, Dane's response, fair cloak. Ooh, I love this.
Yes. Yeah, no, I do love, and this is where you can really hear some of the things that Shippy was describing. Of course, it's true of Glowing's narrative throughout, but Dan's responses, as like a good venerable dwarf king should be. I mean, it's like he's almost speaking in aphorisms, right? Like
yes, he is.
Like the things that Dan says, like everyone's like all the cool dwarves are going to be quoting that for like centuries, right?
They will. You're right.
The time of my thought is my own dispel. Oh, that's a good one. Like I'm going to use that one next time. It's very cool. Well, going back to Shippy here for a second in a different section, and this was originally pointed out by Hammond and Scull, so hat tip to them there. But Shippy points out that the contrast between passionate interior and polite or rational expression here, the weakness of the latter is an index of the strength of the former. Thus, the messenger's "things will not seem so well" works as a violent threat. Not too long means extremely rapidly. In reply, Dan's fair cloak implies foul body, and the obscure metaphor of spending the time of my thought indicates a refusal to negotiate under threat. Both participants seek to project a cool, ironic self-control.
Boy, and I can hear Shippy's voice.
Yes, yes, you can. The whole time. And I'm trying not to do my Shippy there too. Yeah,
I know.
Absolutely.
I want to hear your Shippy, man. I want to hear your Shippy one of these days. I just live in fear of the day that Shippy will hear my Shippy, and then they'll never get on the show again.
Yeah, exactly.
So Glowin, of course, his whole thing is like, we know better. We're not going to read that next little bit, but they know full well that Sauron's messenger is not really telling him the whole story. But he's concerned. We can only stall so long, and there are some concerns here. And in fact, I want to talk about a little bit of this again under the guise of Shippy's conversation. He points out a little trick where Glowin's sentences here, they're formally parallel, but they contain unspoken causal connections. And he references this particular passage. So I'm going to read a paragraph that we skipped, but with those unspoken connections added in. This is pretty interesting. So this is in that part about how he's been sent by Dan. So he says this, "Also we crave the advice of Elrond, for the shadow grows and draws nearer, as we can tell because we discover that messengers have come also to King Brandon Dale, and that he is afraid. So we fear that he may yield, because already war is gathering on his eastern borders." I mean, that's exactly what he's saying. And it's all just sort of in there, but not spoken.
So Shippy's sort of supplying all the causal.
That's right.
The causal conjunctions. And
whereas Glowin himself is just kind of, it's like a series of relatively bald statements, right? And he's leaving his own, his audience to connect the dots, right?
Exactly. Right. And that's the taciturn sort of thing that Shippy pointed out earlier, just how dwarves communicate. But it's fascinating a little bit. Really like that.
So then he says why they've come, right? So specifically, they are here to warn Bilbo, get the advice of Elrond, find out a little bit more about this so-called trifle.
Right.
And also, there's the matter of what to do about Dale, because the messenger has also threatened Brand.
Right. Absolutely.
So, one of the things that I love here is like warning Bilbo, right? I mean, that's their conclusion. So it's like, okay, there are two issues here. One is that our realm is being threatened with war by Sauron. That's one issue. The other issue is Bilbo. He's totally onto you, man. Like, he's coming after you. And I wanted to make sure that you knew that Sauron was gunning for you. There's the personal message, and there's like the major political thing. And I love the fact that he puts Bilbo first. Right. He makes it sound like that's the number one reason. Like, we might, be going to war and, we're going to be totally under assault and everything. But what's more important here is that Bilbo, I needed to warn you.
We got to make sure Bilbo knows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that Dan, the king, that's what the king wanted to do. I was sent by him to do two things, to warn Bilbo and then to learn why he wants this thing.
Right. So. But I also wonder if we can see here exactly the kind of pattern that Shippy was just describing. Again, like see him making statements and only implying the causal effect.
Absolutely.
It kind of seems like he's sort of fishing a bit here. Because keep in mind, one thing that's so easy to forget, and I find we sort of forget this all, it's easy for us to forget what we're not supposed to know. Right. That is to say, they have yes, they know about Bilbo and they know about his invisibility ring. They don't know Dan Glowin. None of them. They have no idea this is the Ring of Power. Right. They don't know. They have no idea why Sauron's on about this. They can tell it's weird, right?
Yeah.
For some reason, Sauron's totally obsessed with Bilbo's invisibility ring. I guess he needs to steal something from the Elven King really badly or something because that's what that ring's for, as we all know. But whatever. Okay, he's after. So I think that the fact that he leads with this not only shows, sort of pleasing, concern for his personal friend, but I think it's also clearly an invitation, right? You're going to explain this, right? Why the heck Sauron is so obsessed with Bilbo's ring? What on earth? So here are two facts. He's looking for Bilbo and his magic ring, and he's threatening us with war. Can somebody please explain the causal relationship between these two things? Because we don't see it. Okay.
Yeah, you're right. We're not drawing the connections here.
Yeah, exactly. So please supply the causal links between these two statements.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. I think so. Well, I'm going to go ahead and take Elrond's little segue here next. There's some really key, crucial stuff here that we want to talk about, but let's go ahead and dig in. I'll read the passage first. "You have done well to come," said Elrond. "You will hear today all that you need in order to understand the purposes of the enemy. There is naught that you can do other than to resist, with hope or without it. But you do not stand alone. You will learn that your trouble is but part of the trouble of all the Western world. The ring. What shall we do with the ring? The least of rings, the trifle that Sauron fancies. That is the doom that we must deem. That is the purpose for which you are called hither. Called, I say, though I have not called you to me, strangers from distant lands. You have come and are here met, in this very nick of time, by chance, as it may seem. Yet it is not so. Believe rather that it is so ordered that we who sit here, and none others, must now find counsel for the peril of the world. Now, therefore, things shall be openly spoken that have been hidden from all but a few until this day. And first, so that all may understand what is the peril, the tale of the ring shall be told from the beginning even to this present. And I will begin that tale, though others shall end it."
Well, before we move on, I want to jump in here now that we're actually hearing some dialogue from Elrond. And I feel like we're going to owe Tom Shippey a little something here because we are pulling a lot from Author of the Century on this.
That's true.
But going back to this idea of cultural variation by differences in mode of speech, Shippey points out that because Elrond is far and away the oldest person speaking, his speech is strongly marked by archaism, in particular by unusual use of word order. He goes on to point out how inflexible modern English is with word order, and then he points out...
I'll stop the world and melt with you. Sorry, I thought that word order works for me, but...
I think that's pretty standard. That's pretty standard word order,
That's
I'd
pretty
say.
standard word order. I mean, it's not like,
modern
I'll
English
melt with
example.
you, I'll the world stop, and with you
it's
melt.
It's not like a Yoda
that
thing,
wouldn't
like,
fly,
melt
would
with
it?
you I will. Yeah, it's nothing like that.
Sorry.
So he points out how inflexible the language modern English is with word order. And then points out all these wonderful examples of Elrond breaking those rules, which you'll soon hear.
Yeah, and of course he points out that Elrond's archaism is consistent, achieved not just by vocabulary, the first resort of the amateur medievalist, but also by grammar. It serves to act as a continual reminder of his age, and to make a link with the similarly archaic speech of Isildur, when Gandalf also comes to quote this later on. But of course, Shippy being Shippy, he can't resist getting a dig in on those critics who complain of Tolkien using archaic language. They have failed to realize that he understood archaism far more technically than they ever could, and could switch it on and off at will as he could modern colloquialism.
Yeah, we got some Corey Tom right there.
You can't help it. Yeah,
no, you can't help it. It's impossible.
Yeah, so Sean, I'm not sure. You say we owe Shippy a little something. I'm not sure if we owe him more or less imitating his accent.
I think that's increased our amount owed. Yes. I think
that has increased our debt.
Dinner to like food for a month or something. Like
exactly. That. But no, I mean, and obviously Shippy is right here. The kind of familiarity that Tolkien had with older speech, enables him to do things like that. Not just to, be using old words, as Shippy says. That's really easy, and anybody, can kind of fake adding in vocabulary. But the way that he changes the syntax and the way that the grammar works, that's the hardcore thing. And of course, it's exactly why, as the people who were complaining, I love that letter, and I'm forgetting the number off the top of my head, the letter in which Tolkien talks about when people were complaining about the archaism, and he's like, well, Theoden speaks archaically because that's how he thinks. Like, if we were to just say what he said, and then he gives, he takes a line from Theoden and translates it into modern colloquial speech and says, he would never say that. He would never, because he doesn't think that way. That's not his vocabulary. It's not his idiom, as John Cleese might say. So it's
well done.
It's really it. So yeah, he does a wonderful job. Tolkien does a fantastic job of just sort of giving you this sense of the, that he is speaking, even though he's speaking in modern language, he's sort of speaking out of an older age.
By the way, I believe that's from letter 171 to Hugh Brogan.
There we go.
Thanks to electronic books for that. Yeah.
Thank you for that,
Some
Alan.
good stuff. Yeah, Theoden would certainly think and probably say, thus shall I sleep better. But people who think like that just do not talk a modern idiom. You can have, I shall lie easier in my grave, or I should sleep sounder in my grave like that, rather than if I stayed at home, if you like. But there would be an insincerity of thought, a disunion of word and meaning. For a king who spoke in a modern style would not really think in such terms at all. And he goes on and talks about that. But yeah, that's
exactly. If you translate the sentiment into the modern language, then you have a changing of the sentiment. A person who would use the modern language would not utter that sentiment to start with. So yeah,
exactly. That's the point. So let's talk about some of the actual things that happen here, the actual things that Elrond says. I love this little line that's almost a blink and you miss it moment, because we're getting to kind of the big stuff like called. But this line, you must resist with or without hope, but not alone. Man, ooh, chills in that particular moment.
Yes, but you do not stand alone. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And then we've got, let's see, he calls the meeting to order.
Right. What shall we do about the ring?
What shall we do with the ring?
And he uses a phrase that I think I want to have you revisit a little bit if you've got something on it. That is the doom that we must deem. Remember when we talked about doom back with Mandos?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love this sentence. That is the doom that we must deem. And a little bit on this. We did talk about this back when we covered the doom of Mandos in season 1. In Old English, a doom was not necessarily a bad thing. It didn't have the negative connotation we have now of, your ultimate fate, your destruction, your final destination. Doom, Old English dom, was just a noun related to the word deem, which is Old English daemon. A doom was just something that had been deemed or judged or decided. So a doom was simply a judgment or decision.
Right. Like when they talk about pronounce, I now pronounce my doom, right? Like Faramir says.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a decision. It's the thing it is.
He's giving judgment. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's all Elrond is saying here is we have a decision to make. A doom we must deem.
Yeah.
Yeah. Though I there's also, though of course Tolkien does use the word doom, not exactly again in when modern people like say doom and gloom, right? It's not doom in that sense, but of course we get obviously very strongly in the Tale of Turin Turambar that sense of when he hears the feet of his doom coming upon him, right?
Oh yeah,
that sense of uninevitable
that
destiny,
foreboding. And,
yes, exactly.
His inescapable fate.
Yeah.
Like fate itself has deemed a doom for you, and you cannot escape it, right?
And it's not a good one, Turin. It's not a good one.
So there's a way in which in Tolkien, doom, the word doom means it's almost like one of those words which means one thing and its opposite, right? On the one hand, doom is like a decision that you make about what to do, Sean, exactly as you were saying. But of course, doom also is like when the decision is made for you and there's nothing you can do about it, right?
Right.
The unescapable fate. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that we can hear both of those things here. This is the sentence I quote all the time when I'm talking about doom in Tolkien. This is the doom that we must deem, the two different forms at the same time. The second time, he's 100% talking about our decisions, right? We have a decision that we have to make.
Right.
But he could, but to calling it a doom, of course, again, that still just does mean like the decision that we have made. But there is a sense, especially in the context, right, about, resisting with hope or without it, right? What shall we do? What is going to happen to us? What is going to be our destiny? What is going to be our doom? Well, they're going to deem a doom, and they're also sort of facing their doom. So I think we can definitely hear both of those elements in that sentence.
I agree.
So we've got a real interplay of fate and free will.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that interplay of fate and free will, Corey, I want you to talk a little bit about this whole idea of being called to the meeting when no one's issued the call.
Oh, my goodness. There are several places in the text where by the text, I mean the Lord of the Rings text, the whole text, where, we are sort of reminded, where it's pointed pretty clearly to us that there is something else going on, right? That there is a providence, that there is some guiding hand to events. My favorite is always the one in chapter 2 in the Shadow of the Past, when Gandalf says to Frodo, I can put it no plainer than saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker. And I always want to say, like, really, Gandalf, it's impossible to say it more plainly than that. Like, I bet you could say it more plainer if you tried a little harder. He's still being really indirect, in fact, in that sentence.
That's hilarious.
But nevertheless, although there's a lot of beating around the bush there, that sense of, what, like, although we do have a doom that we have to deem, he immediately segues from that. We have an important decision to make, to saying, but also let me point out, this is not really in our hands, right? Somebody else is kind of driving the bus here, right? You have been called. I mean, that's pretty strong. Like, there is someone has called you here. Someone has orchestrated this entire thing. And for the record, it wasn't me, right?
Right.
So, strangers from distant lands, he says, as if to emphasize the reach of this call, right? This is not a local phenomenon. This is somebody who is orchestrating things on a global scale, right? And with intricate timing, in the very nick of time, by chance as it may seem, right? So although we don't have access to the explanation, right, we might not be able to see the pattern. It might look like luck and chance to us, yet it is not so. Believe rather that it is so ordered. Notice all of these passive voices that he keeps using. Called, so ordered, right? None of them, neither Gandalf, Elrond, none of the wise who talk like this ever use the active voice. Like, they never actually say who is doing the ordering or the calling exactly. But it is so ordered that we must now find the counsel for the perils of the world. So it has been ordained. It is so ordered that we should do this. And so this is a really conspicuous moment in that way. They're all pretty shy about it. I mean, none of them really comes out and states who's doing the calling. None of them really talks about providence. But this is one of those passages that you really can't, like, forget about.
Miss this one.
You can't escape it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very clear that there is definitely an ordering force here. And although, Elrond is again, he's indirect. Gandalf is indirect when he talks about it. Tolkien doesn't jump up and down and shoot off rockets to talk about this kind of thing throughout the Lord of the Rings. But it's really clear that, there is definitely, a divine plan being enacted here.
Yep. And yet, the people here gathered do have a decision to make.
Yes.
They must now find counsel on what to do now that they've been called. And to do that, they need information. They need to know everything about the ring. And Elrond says, I'm going to start.
Well, it is his house, so I guess he has the right to do that.
I talk first. I'm Elrond.
That's right. I've got the
conch shell? From
the
conch shell.
That's the one. Thank you.
From the other Lord of the book?
From the other Lord of the, yes.
The other Lord
exactly.
of the book. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
well
and
said,
actually,
Sean.
this makes me think of Shippy a lot too. Just not in his writing, but in his conversation. I've heard him a couple different times make this joke that basically Elrond is here acting like the worst meeting chair ever, like this exactly the kind of meeting chair that you hate, right? Who calls the meeting and then is like, I'm going to now talk for like 3 solid hours without interruption and make you all listen to me. And it's like, that's, that's,
that is so true and so funny. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's I'm
going to have you read that. All right.
All right. Let's do that. Then all listened while Elrond in his clear voice spoke of Sauron and the Rings of Power and their forging in the second age of the world long ago. A part of his tale was known to some there, but the full tale to none. And many eyes were turned to Elrond in fear and wonder as he told of the elven smiths of Eregion and their friendship with Moria and their eagerness for knowledge by which Sauron ensnared them. For in that time he was not yet evil to behold, and they received his aid and grew mighty in craft, whereas he learned all their secrets and betrayed them, and forged secretly in the mountain of fire the one ring to be their master. But Celebrimbor was aware of him, and hid the 3 which he had made, and there was war, and the land was laid waste, and the gate of Moria was shut. Then through all the years that followed he traced the ring, but since that history is elsewhere recounted, even as Elrond himself set it down in his books of lore, it is not here recalled. For it is a long tale, full of deeds great and terrible, and briefly though Elrond spoke, the sun rode up the sky, and the morning was past ere he ceased.
My goodness. Even though he spoke briefly, it still took him all morning.
Yeah.
And that last little bit just frustrates me so much.
Yep.
Hey, Elrond tells this whole story in his books of lore, but it's not here recalled.
Right.
So
his books of lore that we can buy where? At,
right, exactly. Which don't have access to. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So we get the Forging of the Rings, of course. The friendship of the Smiths with Moria. I wanted to bring something in from that. In letter 153, that's a draft to Peter Hastings. He's the one who managed the Catholic bookstore in Oxford. So, he has a lot of things to say in that letter that are interesting. But Tolkien says of this particular relationship between the Elven Smiths of Eregion and the Dwarves of Moria, he says this: the Noldor, or lore masters, were always on the side of science and technology, as we should call it. They wanted to have the knowledge that Sauron genuinely had, and those of Eregion refused the warnings of Gil-galad and Elrond. The particular desire of the Eregion elves, an allegory, if you like, of a love of machinery and technical devices, is also symbolized by their special friendship with the Dwarves of Moria. So, I mean, my first thought is maybe that friendship isn't quite the good thing we want it all to be. I mean, it's more a symbol of the Noldor's love of science and technology than it is, I don't know, they suddenly recanted and they're now open-minded towards the stunted people.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
It is a little uncomfortable to think like, so the elves of Eregion were great friends with the dwarves of Moria, and that was a really bad sign. I mean, boy, if you couldn't...
Exactly.
If that didn't tip you off that something was awry there, then I don't know what will.
Right. You don't want to think that way. You want it to be like a good thing that they're elves and dwarves are friends again. But then you realize, there's a reason, because these are Noldor and they want technology. So those guys have technology. Let's be friends with them.
Yeah.
Pretty horrible.
It is. I mean, now
It really is. Yeah.
I don't think that we necessarily have to take it all. Again, if we take it the next step to say, therefore, being friends with the dwarves is a sign of moral corruption. Like, I don't think that that's necessarily what he was saying. I think what he means is this just shows you what the Noldor were interested in. Right. They had this interest in common with the dwarves, whereas most of the elves don't. And on the one hand, like, does it mean that the Noldor are more open-minded? Okay. I mean, maybe it does. But the point is, it means they're more like the dwarves. And therefore, they have many of the same weaknesses, when they go wrong, when a Noldor goes wrong, he goes wrong in a similar way to the way that the dwarves go wrong. And we just heard from Gimli, or not Gimli, listen to me, I'm doing it too.
Yeah,
we just heard from Glowin. About how they delve too greedily and too deep, right? That's what happens when dwarves go wrong. So the greediness.
I'm seeing that now as a TV series. When dwarves
go wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. Boy. Yeah. That could be an unpleasant show. But anyway, let's hope that's not like a TVMA rated show.
Yeah. It's like a spin-off of the Amazon show.
An unpleasant spin-off. But anyway, so the point is that, again, these presumably, like Sindar, would go wrong, or like the Sylvan elves, they have their own ways of going wrong, when they go wrong, but they're not going to go wrong in that way, right?
Right.
So the fact that they were, that the kind of friendship that they had shows that they were really interested in similar things and had therefore, those similar kinds of weaknesses, I think.
I think so.
And I think that makes sense because, I mean, as much as we will beat up on Feanor all day, every day,
do. Yeah.
And we do. And Celebrimbor was the son of Curufin and therefore the grandson of Feanor.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that he was one of the better ones in that family. I mean, we're told in...
I mean, he explicitly repudiated his father.
Yeah,
so,
right. And I'm thinking, that's in the story of Turin Turambar, isn't it? I think it's when.
Yes.
Oh no, maybe it's Baron and Luthien.
Yeah,
Baron and Luthien. Yeah,
right.
It's after his father goes after Luthien, and he's in Nargothrond. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we want Celebrimbor to be a little bit less manipulative and not just become friends with the dwarves just because of all the stuff he can learn, but.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there is a sign of there is kind of a sign of something bad coming on the horizon, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. The glimpse that we get, I mean, and some of this kind of touches on, Sean, the frustrating non-story that we get about, those years and the time that the place where we get a lot of that is in Unfinished Tales, in the history of Galadriel and Celeborn. About how the land was laid waste and all that. So let's see. After the rings had been made, when at length Celebrimbor discovered the existence of the One Ring, he revolted against Sauron and went to Lorinand, that is, to Lothlorien, to take counsel once more with Galadriel. They should have destroyed all the rings of power at this time, but they failed to find the strength. That's really interesting. Galadriel counseled, it really is. Galadriel counseled him that the 3 rings of the elves should be hidden, never used, and dispersed far from Eregion, where Sauron believed them to be. It was at that time that she received Nenya, the White Ring, from Celebrimbor, and by its power the realm of Lorinand was strengthened and made beautiful. So one is tempted to say, well played by Galadriel, right there.
I know, exactly. You should probably get the rings far, far away from Eregion. I don't know, someplace where one of them might be safe.
You know what?
Maybe a forest.
I've got a finger. Yeah,
exactly. Just saying,
And not the one I offered to Feanor.
Exactly.
Well,
anyway, okay.
Sorry.
But its power upon her was great also and unforeseen, for it increased her latent desire for the sea and for return into the west, so that her joy in Middle-earth was diminished. Celebrimbor followed her counsel that the Ring of Air and the Ring of Fire should be sent out of Eregion, and he entrusted them to Gil-galad in Lindon. So again, we don't get the whole and of course you can see how, the story really focuses on Galadriel here, because of course that's the context of it in the history of Galadriel and Celeborn.
Right.
So we're only kind of getting almost sort of a secondhand account of what Celebrimbor was thinking here. But yeah, that sense of that, I mean, the part that I'm so fascinated by there, the elves like Galadriel and Celeborn failing to find the strength to destroy the rings of power.
Yeah.
That you can see that it's, it's pretty clear that the rings of power, the three rings, like those which are unsullied and which Sauron never touched, were still kind of a bad idea, right? I mean, they
still have a hold on them, don't they? Yeah,
exactly. And, so that, again, this one little glimpse that we get into this story that Elrond doesn't tell at length. And then, of course, the horrible destruction, right? And the other word that I wanted to bring up that really kind of jumps out at me is revolted. When Celebrimbor discovered the existence of the One Ring, he revolted against Sauron.
Yeah.
Right, almost as if it's like a rebellion against his lord, right?
His lord,
yeah. And which I think certainly does sort of go to show the kind of hold that Sauron had gained over him, but it's kind of a humbling way to characterize Celebrimbor's rejection of Sauron. Again, rejection would be a more, distinguished word to use for Celebrimbor's reaction, or but no, he doesn't. He revolted against Sauron.
We like to think that he rejected him almost as an equal, maybe not quite an equal, but as some degree of peers. But yeah, this does make it sound like they were truly serving Sauron. And a few episodes ago, Alan, we talked about the line. I think it's at the beginning of many meetings when Gandalf
that they never again will serve him.
Yes,
right.
And we talked about, when did we see any explicit statement that they did serve him? And it's not explicit, but this might be the closest we get.
Yeah, no, I mean, the implication, and again, I think it's not that Celebrimbor and the others had, sworn an oath of fealty to Sauron or anything, but basically, like, they were being taken in. Like, they had been successfully bamboozled, and not just not just deceived, right? They were being played. He was winning. Sauron's plan was to dominate them. That was a goal. That's the whole point. Right, of the whole ring of power thing, was for him to gain control over them. And guess what? He had it. He was gaining it. It was clearly not quite complete, because Celeborn could still revolt against it. So he was not wholly enslaved, but you get the clear sense that he was definitely, a not insignificant route down that path towards enslavement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So after that, we get this little one paragraph we skip, because again, we can't read all of it. We get the glory and fall of Numenor. So he talks basically about the Akalabaith, the kings of men coming back out of the deeps of the sea. We get a little bit about the last alliance of elves and men. And then we get Elrond's personal memory, which I absolutely love. And Sean, I think I've got you reading this one.
Yeah. Thereupon Elrond paused a while and sighed. I remember well the splendor of their banners, he said. It recalled to me the glory of the elder days and the hosts of Beleriand. So many great princes and captains were assembled. And yet not so many, nor so fair as when Thangorodrim was broken, and the elves deemed that evil was ended forever. And it was not so. You remember? Said Frodo, speaking his thought aloud in his astonishment. But I thought, he stammered as Elrond turned towards him, I thought that the fall of Gil-galad was a long age ago. So it was, indeed, answered Elrond gravely, but my memory reaches back even to the elder days. Eärendil was my sire, who was born in Gondolin before its fall, and my mother was Elwing, daughter of Dior, son of Luthien of Doriath. I have seen 3 ages in the west of the world, and many defeats, and many fruitless victories.
Man, there's so much history packed in that little tiny paragraph, isn't there?
Oh, the bombshells that he just drops there. Oh, by the way, and this is my father, and this is my mother.
And Luthien's my
grandmother. Yeah.
Or my great-grandmother, yeah.
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 And I've been around for 3 ages, yeah.
Yeah. And so, like one question, that kind of needs to be asked here is like, so is Elrond just name dropping here? Like, what's
seriously?
I mean, not only here, but even before he starts literally name dropping of the great, like basically everybody famous from the first age.
Yeah,
like, and I'm pretty much related to all of them. But even before that, even before, like when he starts, when he lapses into the first person, right?
Yeah.
It recalled to me the glory of the elder days and the hosts of Beleriand, yet not so many, nor so fair as when Thangarojin was broken. And it's like, he's like, okay with the name dropping. Like, what's he?
We get it.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, I was there.
Yeah.
I was there. Yeah. I was there right here. This
exactly.
guy. Yeah.
Right.
I was there then. I was there then. I was over there.
I mean, because notice, it's like he escalates, right? He doesn't just say like the Battle of the Last Alliance. I was totally there, but you know what I thought about the Battle of the Last Alliance? It was cool, but not as cool as the Battle of Thangarojin.
I was totally at the War of Wrath. Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so
that does sound a little self-aggrandizing, doesn't it?
It's potentially. Now, I don't like to think that that's Elrond's motivation here.
No.
So again, I think like sort of the context here. Remember the so he's just been doing this whole speech that we don't get sort of mercifully because the chapter's long enough of like the whole history. So it seems like the point that Elrond is making, like the reason he's pausing for these, for all the for the recollections and the name dropping, is to sort of, I don't know, to like make it real. This is not ancient history, folks, right? This is not just a random history. And also, by the way, this is not hearsay. Right. I'm not just recycling lore that has been handed down. This isn't
Tolkien saying some say.
Right. Some have said. Yeah, no, exactly. This is like I'm telling you what I'm telling you what I know. Right. So like I have been around and I've been an eyewitness to most of these things that I'm describing. But also secondly, you think about going back to where he went before he transitioned into the history with the doom that we must deem, right? Like, I am bringing to this conversation, right? We are bringing, this, the discussion we are about to have, the decision we're about to make is going to be done in the context of, direct knowledge of all of these things. So again, we're not isolated here. We're not
right.
Think of that sense that so often comes up in Tolkien, especially among the Rohirrim, for instance, right? And even Faramir has that sense of like, I am a lesser son of greater sires, that whole sense of like, we're kind of inadequate to handle this situation like our great sires might have done.
Yeah.
Elrond is sort of almost counterbalancing that, being like, there is a continuity between us and them, right? And it's me. No, but
there are still some of us left who remember. Yeah,
you're looking at him,
exactly. But we are like, this is we are still in that story, and and we are able to do that from the context of anyway. So I think it's more than just self-aggrandizing, even though it kind of potentially comes across that
kind of looks like it, right?
Yeah.
Now I want to touch on one other thing that comes up in this. There's a single line at the end of the first paragraph here where he says, the elves deemed that evil was ended forever, and it was not so. Now, Shippey has an observation about that, in Author of the Century, which, folks, if you don't have, go get, by the way. He says, this concept, because really we owe him. At the least we owe him like 20 book sales.
Please go buy a copy of this book.
It's like the recurring subtext of the whole episode, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Purchase Author of the Century.
It'll be in our show notes.
Exactly. So Shippey says that this concept that evil could be ended forever may recall the belief that World War I was fought as the war to end all wars, but Tolkien lived both through the time of that belief and its total failure with the second outbreak of war in 1939.
Absolutely.
So the idea that evil could be defeated, right? And I wanted to get your insight on that one, Corey, because I think that was one of my gripes. I'll just say this and then I'll let you run with it. One of my gripes about the films, as much as Sean and I actually did enjoy the first three films, was this sense that evil could really be defeated if only the good guys all got together.
Right.
And there was this sense of like, we could do this if we just unite. But really, evil can't be defeated. That's the whole Beowulf connection.
Right. Well, and even more than that in a sense. And I think that we've already seen and kind of touched on ways in which, in thinking about Celebrimbor and the Elves of Eregion, and thinking about the dwarves of Khazad-dûm delving too deep, and even the disquiet among the dwarves of Erebor. The point, the reason that evil can't ever be permanently defeated is that evil is not just a thing that comes from without. It's a thing that comes from within, right? You know, and that's it's the thing that always frustrates me. I totally get why people say like, oh, Tolkien is all black and white and it's everything that always annoys me. But of course, the reason that it annoys me is that Tolkien is particularly good at showing how people who have good intentions and, you know, start in a good place can often, you know, make choices that end up leading to horrible, like the Númenóreans, again, like all these people that we've been talking about. So for that reason, of course, you're never going to be able to permanently defeat evil because it can always break out again. And you could get another Saruman, you know, you can get another Boromir, you could, you know, we see it breaking out all over the place.
Yeah. It's whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
I mean, really, you hit one, another one's going to pop up. It's just the way it's going to be. Evil abhors a vacuum just like nature does.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, if there's ever anything to gain, somebody's going to try to gain it, you know, evilly, if I can say that. So,
And that's what's great about, you know, bringing us back to this last line that Elrond says that I read about he's seen many defeats and many fruitless victories.
Yes.
This is a trend. This game of Dark Lord Whack-a-Mole, evil Whack-a-Mole. This is history. He's seen it so many times.
It is. It absolutely is.
If the fruit that you expect victory to bear is permanent peace, then it's never going to bear that fruit.
It'll always be fruitless.
That's correct. It will never. You're absolutely right. My goodness. I'm sure our listeners already know we're running a little longer than our typical episode. So we're getting to our last point before we wrap up. We're going to kind of finish up Elrond's conversation here. I'm sorry, not Elrond's conversation here, but Boromir's conversation, his interruption of Elrond. I'm going to go ahead and read that, and we'll discuss it, and then we'll wrap up the show. By the way, I'm sure you all aren't complaining about the fact that we've had over 2 hours with the Tolkien Professor, and neither are we.
That's what I'm thinking. Clear, I don't think we have to apologize too much.
All right.
And anyone who listens to my podcast is going to be like, 2 hours, we're just getting started.
Exactly.
Right.
How in the world did you get him to cover 5 pages in that amount of time?
Right.
We dragged him along. We wrapped the elf rope around his neck, and he goes,
"It burns us. It burns us, precious."
So I'm trying not to laugh at that. I'm going to pick up here. At this is when Elrond is explaining that Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand. At this, the stranger Boromir broke in. "So that is what became of the ring," he cried. "If ever such a tale was told in the South, it has long been forgotten. I have heard of the great ring, of him that we do not name, but we believe that it perished from the world in the ruin of his first realm. Isildur took it. That is tidings indeed." "Alas, yes," said Elrond. "Isildur took it, as should not have been. It should have been cast then into Orodruin's fire, nigh at hand where it was made. But few marked what Isildur did. He alone stood by his father in that last mortal contest. And by Gil-galad only Círdan stood, and I. But Isildur would not listen to our counsel. 'This I will have as weregild for my father and my brother,' he said. And therefore, whether we would or no, he took it to treasure it. But soon he was betrayed by it to his death. And so it is named in the north Isildur's Bane. Yet death maybe was better than what else might have befallen him." Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
Oh,
yeah.
That is great. Yeah. So now one of the things that an objection or question that I've heard a lot about this passage and a bunch of things like it in The Lord of the Rings. People are like, dude, why is this news to Boromir? Shouldn't he know? I mean, he's from Gondor. You'd think, but
it's a long time ago, though.
It's a long time ago. That's the number one. People, it's very easy to forget both how long the distances are in Middle-earth and how long the spans of time are in Middle-earth history. It's Isildur, that was 3,000 years ago. I mean, think back. It's like expecting, like the modern leaders of Egypt to be intimately familiar with like the policies of Ramses the Great. I mean, that's the amount of time we're talking about. So like, do they remember him? Yeah, sure. Of course. Famous figure from history. But what do they know about like what he did and exactly what caused his, doubtless they have speculation, but again, it's a long time ago. And also keep in mind, like, how much news came back to Gondor about the death of Isildur? the disaster of the
Right.
Rhine Fields.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. Not much.
No, none. I mean,
None.
nobody.
Yeah,
because
it all went north, right?
It all went north. Now, doubtless, like, they probably sent a letter like, "Hi, so dear
Isildur's dead.
So
we regret to
died.
inform you that
we regret to inform you that the entire force that went north was slaughtered." Hugs and smooches, Elrond. So, I mean, like, that's... We're very sorry for your loss. But
yes, exactly.
Anyway, like, they just don't know. So, just thinking that it's easy for a reader to forget the privileged position, especially if you've read the appendices and stuff, right?
Yeah.
We're in this, like, ridiculously privileged... There's nobody in Middle-earth who knows all that at the time of the story.
Right.
I mean, almost no one who knows all of it. Elrond and Gandalf know most of it, but even they don't know all of it. So, it's just, it's a natural question to ask, but it's super important to remember. And, Isildur was not exactly talking about the ring.
No.
After he took it. Right.
He wasn't, hey guys, look what I found. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He didn't show it off in the town square when he came back to, after the battle.
He didn't embed it in his crown and wear it at festivals.
For instance. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, this reminds me of, one of the things that Michael Drought talked about that we come back to a lot, the idea of the epistemic regime.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that some characters know more than others. And so here's a situation where we as the reader, like you said, Corey, we know a lot more than anybody else in the scene right now.
Yes.
And that gives us this great moment where Boromir hears this about Isildur, and his first reaction is, that is tidings indeed, which to me reads like, oh, that is good tidings. That's great news. Isildur took it. I mean, I don't know if I'm reading too much into that, but he almost seems excited to learn that Isildur took the ring. And then Elrond's immediate response is, yes, but that should not have
Alas,
been.
Idiot.
Yes.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. Clearly that is tidings indeed, is, I mean, as Sam would say, that's an eye opener, right? Is sort of one thing that he means. But at the same time, I mean, presumably, I take from Boromir's words here that, first of all, do they even know that I mean, like the average Gondorian on the street, do they know that Sauron had a ring of power? Like, do they even know that it existed? It seems Boromir does, right? I mean, he doesn't say like, what, a ring? Tell me more about this ring of which you speak, right? He says, I have heard of the great ring of him we do not name, right? But we believed it perished from the world. So I agree with you that this idea, it's almost like this new hope has burst upon him, right? Wait a second, like, the like killer weapon of the enemy is still around. Like Isildur took, and if Isildur took it, if you're Boromir and you heard that Isildur took it, what does that tell you? Taking it was clearly the right thing to do, right? Because I mean, Isildur took it, right? The dude that I've seen the statue of that's like 400 feet tall, like, if Isildur did it, then obviously this is going to be plan A, right? Plan A is we're gonna fulfill the task that Isildur started and use the ring against Sauron, right? Brilliant,
right?
Yeah, I love how you can see the kind of the seeds of his thinking there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I just want to point out one other little thing. Círdan was there.
Yeah,
I know you mentioned that earlier, but here's just another page of his CV.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, well,
that's actually probably a good trivia question. Who was there when Isildur didn't throw the ring into the fire? Everybody's going to say Elrond.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that everybody's going to remember Círdan.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
True. Yeah.
A question I always had: where's Galadriel?
Yeah.
Why is she not there? Or Celeborn? Or anyway, just I mean, I'm sure she was, constructively occupied at the time, but
that is interesting. Yeah.
You'd think that they would have sent a pretty sizable force. From,
I mean, she have something better to do. I mean, it's like,
seriously, you're right.
It's kind of the defining battle of her age. Yeah,
exactly. Right. I mean, it's like, I don't know.
I'm sorry, I'm getting my hair done that Saturday. I can't come.
Maybe there was some kind of backdoor action that she was guarding against or something. I don't know. I mean, I doubt.
Maybe
it's just.
I'll just keep guard here from the north in case you don't want any flanking movements coming down for the plains there. You don't
Right.
want to.
I mean, of course, I think I know the answer to that question, or not the question of where she is or why she's not mentioned, because when Tolkien wrote that sentence, he hadn't invented her yet. But
right, exactly. There,
but still,
well, there's that.
That's the kind of thing that he normally retcons.
Go back and fill in.
True.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Interesting. That's very now I'm absolutely stuck on that. She's like, oh, you know what? The Wainwriters might be coming, so we'll just set up some watchmen, and
you never know.
I have a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, well, Sean, give us a little bit of word nerdery on Weregild. I'm sure about at least half our audience knows what that is, but real quick.
Yeah, sure. So it basically just means man gold or man payment. It's an ancient legal concept in Germanic law. It basically was the amount of compensation that a person would have to pay to an injured party, or if they'd actually killed somebody, to their family as compensation for what they'd done.
Okay.
And so
he's taking
in this case,
from
Isildur is
Sauron.
saying, I'm going to take this as compensation for Elendil and an Aryan.
And because we're talking about a king and a prince, it's a pretty high value. So
True,
the man gold would have been much more expensive. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah, because I understand it would have been higher depending on their social status.
Definitely. But keep in mind, this is also Isildur's equivalent of Gollum's birthday present. Right.
Exactly.
Oh, sure.
He is
Just an
giving
excuse
himself
to
a
This is a
justification,
rationalization
right?
for sure. Yeah.
I mean, as if Sauron would pay a weregild for crying out loud. Right?
I know.
I mean,
like he follows the law.
Right. I mean, so like on the one hand, like basically he has looted Sauron's corpse and taken the Ring of Power, which is fine.
Yep.
Like totally justifiable. Right. But yeah, that it's clearly a red flag. Right. This whole, I mean, the Weregild thing. Yeah. Totally legal and everything. But it also was Smeagol's birthday. That doesn't make it any less of
doesn't make it the only reason that he wants it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He right-clicked on Sauron's body and clicked loot all.
Exactly.
I mean, that's really what he did.
Yeah.
Oh, neat. A ring of invisibility. Cool.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, actually, no, it wasn't cool, of course, at the time.
No, as Elrond
that's
points
true.
out, very far from cool.
Right.
And it was also literally quite hot.
Literally hot, yes, exactly.
Hot as a gleed.
Literally, figuratively, yes. Or as Sean, as you tried to say earlier, literatively.
Literally, I think I said.
That was a very funny blooper in the last episode, yes.
I came up with the perfect midpoint between literally and figuratively. The internet will be so happy.
That's it.
Yes. The millennials will go crazy because they'll finally have a word that really means what they say.
Right.
When they say literally. So we're just going to wrap up here a little bit before we move on into the bag. What was accomplished by the Battle of Dagorlad? We get a little bit here in terms of what actually happened. Sauron's diminished. He's not destroyed, though. The ring is lost, so at least he doesn't have any power from that. Dark Tower's broken, but hey, it's not completely gone. So, we made some progress. It's a good thing, but it's a temporarily good thing, and we know that. And in the meantime, we've lost many elves and many mighty men and many of their friends. So, and then this is interesting, kind of at the end of the paragraph.
Alan,
go ahead.
I want to interject right there.
Yeah.
I see a little bit more of World War I in that.
Mm-hmm.
I do too.
We've lost many elves and many men. The Dark Tower was broken, but its foundations were not removed. Therefore, it's not the war to end all wars.
Right.
We're going to have another.
We know it's going to come back.
And
you're absolutely
just
right,
as
Sean.
just as the end of World War I was called even at the time, a 20 years peace. This is going to last longer, right? This peace is going to be significantly longer than 20 years. But of course, there's a kind of irony there, right? I mean, the peace is going to last essentially for almost 3,000 years. But what that means is that when the next war finally comes around and Sauron has regained his strength and returns almost as strong as he was before. Now the elves have been waning for 3,000 years. The Numenorians have been waning.
Right.
Now the strength to oppose him is going to be much, much weaker. So the inevitable passage of time, but even though, you could say, well, see how much more they accomplished. I mean, 3,000, 3 millennia of comparative peace is still a pretty good accomplishment, and it is, but it does ironically put them in a worse place later.
It does. It sets them up for failure because now with the separation of elves and men, now you're not even going to be able to have an alliance between them anymore.
Right.
Because the elves are being supplanted.
Yeah. And
as
and
we've been talking
both
about
parties
for
are
years.
weakened. I mean, there's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to have to move the history of the race of Numenor to our next episode. I'm not saying we're going to do 6 episodes on the Council of Elrond, but we're not going to be able to make this one any longer. So we're going to go ahead and skip that part for now. We'll bring it back up next time. So that may wrap up our discussion on the first few pages. Sorry, Corey. I know we probably only should have done a few paragraphs of the Council of Elrond. But, we are not done yet. Folks, we've got Bartleman's Bag here coming your way. And even when that's done, the talk continues all night long at the Prancing Pony.
That's right. We've always got lots of discussion happening in our social media spaces. At our common room on Facebook, you'll find comments, questions, corrections, and more on every episode, as well as updates from us throughout the week. Just look for the Prancing Pony Podcast on Facebook and click the like and follow buttons.
And now we have another common room over on Reddit. You can find great discussions there at r/Prancing Pony Pod. And as always, you can find us on Twitter and on Instagram with the handle @Prancing Pony Pod. So follow us wherever you happen to be. And if you like us, please share us. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, wherever you can find Tolkien fans, let them know about us.
And if you really want to let the world know your feelings about us, give us a review on iTunes.
If they're good feelings.
Especially if they're good feelings. Hey, we'll take them all, but especially if they're good.
Yeah.
We especially like the good ones. The more reviews we have, the more visible our podcast is, which helps others find us and this great community of Tolkien fans that we've built together.
That's right. And finally, if you want some access to exclusive content like our episode postscripts, quarterly specials, PPP swag, and more, check out patreon.com/prancingponypod to find out how you can join the fellowship of the podcast. Now, I think it's time to see, finally, what old Bartleman has in the mailbag for us. Corey, we hope you're going to feel free to jump into these answers anytime you want.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, Sean, what does Bartleman have for us?
Okay, well, the question we have tonight is from Paul Day in Bristol, who asked us a question about the last chapter. He says when the ring is taken out in Imladris by Frodo to show Bilbo, there's an effect in the hall which chills the atmosphere. Or is that just between Frodo and Bilbo? Well, apparently, it doesn't happen when the ring is used by Bilbo in the halls of the Elven King. The nameless one, he says. Sir not named in the book The Hobbit.
Right. Sir not
named in this book.
Yes.
Yeah. Paul says, wouldn't the elves of Mirkwood sense the One Ring's presence like the elves of Rivendell?
Now, we talked about this moment back in episode 140, and here's the passage from Many Meetings. Bilbo put out his hand, but Frodo quickly drew back the ring. To his distress and amazement, he found that he was no longer looking at Bilbo. A shadow seemed to have fallen between them, and through it he found himself eyeing a little wrinkled creature with a hungry face and bony groping hands. He felt a desire to strike him, and in the next paragraph we read that the music and singing round them seemed to falter, and a silence fell. Now, we thought that seemed literal. In other words, the exchange between Bilbo and Frodo regarding the ring was noticed by others in the Hall of Fire, and it seemed to impact the singing and music.
Yeah, we did. In fact, if I recall correctly, I think I even compared it to the scene in a Western movie, when the piano player stops playing.
Right, exactly.
So
the bar fight's about to break out.
Right. And Corey, I'm curious about your thoughts here. Is the music literally stopping, or does it just seem to be from Frodo's perspective?
I don't think it's literally stopping. And the reason I don't think that is that I think that whole description from the passage that's given, it's focused very strongly on Frodo's point of view. Right? When we're getting what it looks and feels like from Frodo. He found he was no longer looking at Bilbo. A shadow seemed to have fallen between them, and he thought, and as though he found himself eyeing a little ring. This is all. Frodo's the only one who sees this. Frodo's the only one who experiences this. Nobody else can see any of that. The only one who sees anything is Bilbo, and all he sees is the expression on Frodo's face. Right. And he, draws his conclusions in response to that. So there are two things that I would say. I don't think the music is actually stopping. I do think that when, we hear about the resumption of the music, and again, it seems to me that the description there is of like Frodo becomes aware of the music around him again, the kind of little like focus bubble that, surrounds him so that, he no longer even hears his surroundings drops. And things kind of resume. Notice Sam, who's sitting right next to them, doesn't even react. Like nobody reacts. Yeah. Nobody says anything. Even Sam doesn't say anything, and he's sitting right there next to them with them. In fact, Sam doesn't even. It's we. In Exploring Lord of the Rings, we spent about 45 minutes talking about Sam's non-reaction to this whole thing. In fact, if I give a little plug, episode 114 of Exploring the Lord of the Rings is the episode in which we discussed this this paragraph.
Okay.
Basically.
Where you spent 45 minutes talking about something that isn't even mentioned.
Talking
in the
about
book.
Sam's non-reaction. Well,
right,
okay,
exactly.
No, we didn't get to it. That's in the beginning of episode 115 because we didn't get to that in 114. But anyway, this is actually this scene was it's on my top 10 list of things that I never really thought about enough until going through it slowly and exploring the Lord of the Rings. The significance of what Bilbo does and says after this is such a huge deal. This is an incredible breakthrough moment for Bilbo and just a really beautiful thing. Now, here's the other thing, though, that I would say. Do I think nobody notices? No. I think that we're not told anything about what they do or what they say or don't say, but I am like dollars to donuts. Gandalf and Elrond are both watching this whole thing the entire time, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, you think about it, they know, Gandalf, they have carefully kept the two of them apart. I don't just mean like, here in the last couple of weeks, he's been there. Do you think that Bilbo has ever been sitting in Frodo's room while Frodo was comatose without a chaperone? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. You are absolutely right.
And like, do you think there's maybe a reason why Bilbo has never visited or written in this time? Like, but what information has he been given? Bilbo, I mean, nothing, almost nothing, right? Keep in mind, there's no evidence to suggest that Bilbo knows that his ring is the ring of power.
That's correct.
He doesn't know that. There's no way he could know that. They're certainly not telling him. Right. They're not talking to him about this.
And his reaction later in the Council of Elrond seems to suggest that he just learns it at that point.
Exactly. That is, I think, when he learns it. So anyway, the point is they know because, and there's a reason they've done all this, right? Because they know Bilbo could relapse. They know the risk of this.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So
for sure.
You've got to think that this whole, and so what has happened? This had to come about, right? Frodo and Bilbo, obviously you're not going to keep them apart the whole time. And they know that Bilbo is going to be tempted to want to see the ring. What could be more natural, right? He wouldn't even necessarily understand why it would be a bad thing. How could he know?
Right, because he doesn't know.
It's just his ring.
He doesn't know it's the one ring.
Right. So look what has happened. They have contrived to have this meeting happen in what seems to be literally the safest possible conditions.
Exactly.
Right. In a public room, in the middle of a room, surrounded by everybody. Right. And amidst all of the positive vibes of elvish music. Right. With Elrond and Gandalf both sitting right there watching the whole time.
Exactly.
And nothing happens. And he puts it away. So again, I do think that there's a lot of attention on them in the the room, at least from. And I've got to think Glorfindel's got to be watching too, right? I mean, they're all there.
Oh, sure.
So. But I don't think that the music actually stops. I do think that from Frodo's perspective, it's very real, and it's supposed to be this really jarring kind of change. But what we don't get is any indication that anyone from Sam on up is for Sam on out, I mean, like in radius from them.
Yeah, sure.
Like has any reaction or even seems to notice or acknowledge that the thing happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I got to tell you, my answer changed from the previous episode, but not because of yours, I have to say. So I actually did have this prepared. But,
okay.
The question was, if it does really stop the revelry in the Hall of Fire, which you'll soon learn that I no longer think it did, why didn't it do that when he was in the halls of the Elven King? Well, like I said, my initial thoughts are I was wrong to assume that the music actually faltered. Now, if you'll remember, folks, my conclusion regarding what Frodo was seeing in Bilbo, the little wrinkled creature with the hungry face and bony groping hands, my conclusion was that was an illusion of sorts, a vision that the ring overlaid on Bilbo.
Yes.
And maybe sort of a preview of sorts for the reality of Gollum. But if that was a vision of Bilbo and not the actual reality, I think that coming to the same conclusion about the music is similarly reasonable.
Yeah.
Sort of like that moment in a movie when the music drops to an absurdly low volume as some very important dialogue is spoken. Now, we don't get anybody saying, put that thing back where it came from, or so help me, which I would think would be an absolutely awesome moment. A little Billy Crystal right in there. But in the next paragraph, we get two things happen. First, the shadow passed, leaving hardly a shred of memory. And then the light and music of Rivendell was about him again, about Frodo again. So I see it, like you just said, Corey, as Frodo becoming aware of the music again after having lost it for a moment during that confrontation with Bilbo.
Yeah. Actually, that makes sense. Honestly, I've changed my answer on this, and I have changed my answer because of not only the explanation that both of you just gave, but really the conversation that we were having earlier about the fact that the One Ring's identity and all the stuff that we're discussing at the Council of Elrond is not common knowledge to anybody there.
Yes.
I'll be honest. I had an answer prepared about how, the elves of Rivendell are Noldor and the elves of Mirkwood are Nandor, ruled by Sindar.
Yeah. Sure.
And, to be fair, that I think is true. The Rings of Power were a Noldorin affair. And there's really no reason why Thranduil or anybody else in his kingdom should have any particular knowledge of the Rings of Power. So one might suspect that there would be more in Rivendell who would recognize the ring, would know what it is, and would have a reaction to Frodo and Bilbo having this exchange. But as we were discussing earlier, despite that, most of the elves of Rivendell still did not know that. There were a few, Glorfindel, Elrond. But I think that it really doesn't make sense for the music to have literally stopped. So I'm there with you guys now.
All right, we're all on the same page, man. Well, folks, that wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Now, please be sure to join us again next week when Bilbo finally comes clean at the Council of Elrond.
And we'll have to do that with just the two of us. There may never again be any such league between the Prancing Pony and the Tolkien Professor.
Well, not until next week, anyway.
Well, that's true. Fair enough. Oh, man, and we are looking forward to that. As always, folks, we want to thank each of you for listening. And we also want to give a very special thank you to our patrons at the Kierdance contribution tier. That's DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Emily in Texas, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Paul in Colorado, Jerry in Texas, Bruce in California, and Mario in Utah. Thank you all so very much.
Make sure you don't miss a single episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your questions, comments, and most of all, your trifles that Sauron fancies to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com.
I'm not sure I want those, actually. But,
well, they might be worth a little something.
So
I don't know.
If your listeners send you the trifle, will you give them like the dwarf rings, the kingdom that they desire, and everything else they could want in the world?
Absolutely.
I'll send them a deed to Moria.
There you go.
There you go. There you go. Clear out the wingless Balrog yourself.
That's right. That's right.
It's a fixer-upper.
It's a fixer-upper. I was just going to say that.
Definitely a fixer-upper. Yeah.
But no, folks, Barliman's not always punctual with the mail, but we'll get back to you as soon as we can, and your question or comment may be featured on an upcoming show.
And thanks, guys, for having me. This has been great fun and an excellent honor to be able to join you guys in one of your episodes.
Well, it's truly an honor to have you, Corey. Thank you so much.
Well, folks, this has been far too short a time to spend amongst such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.